feet on any of the Boeings or Airbuses.
So
Captain, is your
by the
connection
way,
better now? Yeah, it
I
is.
switched. I got my earpods in, so my microphone should be better. I don't.
Yeah, it's much better now. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
Uh,
can't hear him.
I think he's dropping out. Yeah, yeah.
And
I'll go
then,
to also swallow it. Oh, sorry, I just muted everyone. Go ahead, Grant.
yeah, and then for the room, if you guys are talking about alien UFOs or military UFOs, my point about the 41,000 is most of this military equipment is flying at 40,000, 38,000, 39,000 feet. Like, this would be. There's no way in the world that the U.S. military is going to start shooting shit out of the sky that it doesn't know what it is. Just not. It's not even real. They're going to
And
know before they attack something.
can I get more clarity from anybody? Maybe also, so I don't know if you can answer that one. But not being able to shoot out the unidentified object in the dark, how common is this? Maybe Alec, we can go back to you, as you got a lot of experience with UFOs. Can you give any context on what that could mean? And if anyone else can, from the audience or from the panel, please, audience, do DM me or put in the comments if you do have any experience and you can give more clarity on this. What does it mean exactly? You can't shoot it down in the dark.
So
I don't.
I think that the issue was that is they couldn't provide a positive ID, the issue over Montana, and that's why they decided to do this weight approach. And specifically, maybe there was concern more like because the Montana is probably more. There's more civilian population, and the concerns of that they can't do proper analysis of where the debris field would be. But I mean, they the U.S. Air Force can't shoot down things at night. They have FLIR capabilities, but there might have been something that when they saw a closer observe that maybe they noticed it wasn't necessarily a huge threat and they wanted to wait until the morning to get more identification to really figure this out. But again, I think I'm going to go back to my previous comment in the beginning, right? And I think this is when I first spoke is the Chinese spy balloon incident, I think, caused a change. Right. And I think there has been a deliberate attempt by the administration because of criticism that was leveled for it for allowing the spy balloon to go through, that they changed the rules of engagement. And I think the issue is if this is an aircraft that is flying, something is flying over U.S. or Canadian territory that should not be there, that it is not either civilian or allowed to fly up there through FAA or whatever the Canadian equivalent is, we're going to shoot it down. And I think
Yeah,
that is because of the criticism of the Chinese balloon, and this is a new rule of engagement, and this might
but
be a more recurring issue.
guys, if they're going to wait until morning to shoot it down, that means it's another balloon, not a jet, because no aircraft has 8 or 9 hours of fuel capacity.
Let me ask you all sorts on that topic. How often
Morning,
would you say that the
there
U.S.
forever.
government, because their initial claim here was it was a UFO, and then they said it was a radar issue, and now you have U.S. congressmen coming out and saying that it's not a radar issue, it's an actual UFO. How frequent would it be for them to just have some sort of anomaly where they have a false alarm on a UFO like they claimed about an hour ago?
I can actually speak to that a little bit, and it's not like crazy common, but we do know with when you say UFO, of course, that's just military parlance, or for anything that's unidentified in airspace. It can be absolutely anything. It can be your neighbor's homemade hot air balloon. But the thing that our military members are sometimes seeing that are called UFOs or sometimes UAP that are actual craft that we can't seem to match in combat. Um, it, these things, they're not easily engaged because they seem to have some kind of radar defeat.
I do have
Interesting.
to
Okay.
jump in on that point for radar
Yeah, go ahead,
identification.
Jake.
So I'm an air traffic controller, and we use radar pretty often, obviously. And as far as like getting blips on the radar that you don't know what it is, happens countless times a day. When I mean countless, at least 50 times, or we literally lose count. Now we're dealing with blips that are a lot lower, so it could be a flock of birds or even a drone, or like one of the other members said, potentially like just your neighbor's balloon or something like that. But it's the same type of technology when you're looking at like 60,000 feet, 40,000 feet. The only difference is there's not a whole lot that's going to be up there other than something that's deliberately placed like a Chinese balloon or something like that. But yeah, as far as they don't know what it is, that would kind of make sense as far as at night not being able to get a proper ID on it and just seeing a small blip on the radar.
Okay, let me say this real quick. It says that the United States says that the object shot down over northeastern Alaska yesterday is the size of a car. We knew that part, but it did not have the ability to maneuver, and we do not know what the origin of the craft was. And earlier today, CNN actually reported that pilots that were assigned to take care of the aircraft or the unknown object in the air were saying that they were so confused on the propulsion system of the aircraft. So why are we still looking at this as, we just have no idea where it came from? Or do we not have the ability to track these things, days ahead?
Exactly. Of course.
Alec?
And
So
I'm trying to see if my microphone's doing a little bit better now with the Wi-Fi.
It is now, yeah.
But
Yeah, go ahead, Captain.
okay, I saw a report that said that the debris field or the debris from the one shot down in northern Alaska was they found a bunch of quote tiny pieces as if it like shredded itself. Now, the difference is that AIM-9X probably hit the actual object, unlike it where it hit the balloon off of South Carolina. So take that with a grain of salt. If it was broken into 1,000 pieces, AIM-9Xs really don't break stuff into tiny little pieces. It's just made to punch big holes in the stuff. So, take that for what it's worth and, add that to your analysis of what this could be.
I'm bringing someone that worked at NORAD now, Nick, so I'll go to you as soon as he comes up so you can ask him the same questions. But just to confirm for anyone listening, because I do get people DMing me, can you reconfirm, Nick, that we are getting conflicting reports on one side of the one side of the report that it's just a sensor blip in terms of the craft over Montana, but then we've got the congressman who reported that there was an unidentified object over Montana. They just couldn't shoot it down in the dark, and the operation will continue tomorrow morning. Is that correct?
So it does seem like originally the Department of Defense had come out and acknowledged the presence of an unidentified flying object. They later came back and said it was just a radar blip issue, but a congressman who obviously congressmen do have a lot more information when it comes to intelligence and classified information. And that Montana congressman eventually came out and said, yes, there was an actual object in the sky, but they're not going to shoot it down in the dark. So that's this is going to be This is a situation that's going to have a lot of developments tonight.
Mateus, anything else to add to this?
Yeah, I'm just getting a link to a Wall Street Journal report. This is on the situation that unfolded over Canada this afternoon. The Wall Street Journal, quoting sources familiar with the situation, is reporting that the object that they shot down, quote, appeared, sorry, I just lost the quote, 1 second, quote, appeared to be a small metallic balloon with a tethered payload. That's being reported by the Wall Street Journal moments ago, and quoting U.S. sources familiar with the situation. I'll link this up in the nest for those who want to see, and I'll also share it with you, Nick, and with you, Mario.
Do we know what the payload
I
is?
also
Have
the
they
new information
said
that we're
anything
getting.
about the payload itself, or is it just a payload, quote unquote?
The exact quote just mentions a payload. It does not go into specific detail, but we obviously do know the size of this, quote, metallic balloon with a tethered payload is around the size of a small car, as reported by U.S. sources.
Okay, let me jump in here real quick. ALX just sent this to me, so shout out to him. I pinned it in the top. Representative Rosendale, the congressman from Montana, says that the Department of Defense called him and said that they will be, quote, tracking the object detected above Montana, quote, until it gets light again, and says, quote, they cannot bring it down in the dark. So that was the exact quote from Fox News that was reported on earlier.
And I just brought up Emergent Perspective. Are you there?
Hey, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, man. Can you tell us a bit about your background, and I would love your thoughts on the situation.
Okay, all right. Let me start with the background. So, in another life, it's been about actually since I left defense contracting, it's probably been about 8 years. But prior to that, I was U.S. Army Air Defense Artillery. I worked on networked air defense systems. We monitored and protected the airspace 30 nautical miles around Washington, D.C., which is typically referred to as the ADIZ. So it was Joint Army Air Defense Operations. We work pretty closely with the Air Force, the F-16s, F-22s, et cetera, based out of Andrews Air Force Base. So we actually worked very closely in a peer capacity with the pilots, because often we would get tracks and they would go up and intercept something or identify it, and we would be basically working with them in peers. So our systems were backups to their engagement capabilities. So let me just kind of, oh, by the way, I wanted to make a comment, clear something up, because a bunch of people had noted, well, the reported objects were moving U.S., Canada, and people were questioning what's the authority there. Something a lot of people don't know is that NORAD is actually a binational command. It is both U.S. and Canadian. So NORAD has the authority to issue a shoot down order for anything in U.S. or Canadian airspace. So that's not an issue. Here's a few specifics. People commented on the unidentified nature of the objects. Something I'll tell you from my experience is any object that enters U.S. airspace that is, quote, unidentified is unlikely to remain so for very long, because there are so many known radar cross sections that are easily cross-referenced against known airframes, for example. Aircraft typically have transponders. I mean, even unknown things like a flock of geese, for example. A flock of migrating geese can generate a radar cross section, but it's typically intermittent. It doesn't last very long. And the typical end result of unknown objects or balloons or flocks of geese is somebody is sent up to intercept. Aircraft is dispatched, and they go and they put eyes on it, and they go, well, that's a flock of geese, and end of scenario. So a couple things on commenting on shoot down in terms of how something would be engaged. For them to order a shoot down on an object in U.S. airspace, so you would need positive ID. A couple people pointed that out, and that's absolutely correct. You would need positive ID on what you're looking at. You would need hostile declaration, which means that they have witnessed the object perform a hostile act, or they have ID'd it as something highly likely to perform a hostile act. So that has to be declared, and normally shoot down authority for something is no less than the 2-star level. That's not something a low rank, that would not be a decision a low ranking person would be authorized to make.
So based on that,
Go ahead.
based on that, they would have to know exactly what it was.
Yes, absolutely, because
and what the threat level,
because in the event, I mean, let's say they dispatched aircraft to an unknown radar track to identify it, put eyeballs on it, and they say, okay, there's some strange balloon, some strange hovering metallic object. What they would do is typically they'd say, well, is it doing anything hostile? Is it shooting at somebody? Is it setting things on fire? If it's not doing any of that, then they would simply follow a protocol of track and report. What is it? What is it doing? Really, shooting something down is as an absolute last resort, only with positive ID.
And NORAD's never shot anything down, to my knowledge. Is that right?
Probably not. I would say during the time that I was at, probably in the last 20 years, no, there have been some close calls. One rather infamous example, there was a congressman, I forget from which state, who flew into D.C. without filing a flight plan and forgot to turn his transponder on, and they came real close. They were pointing things at him before they ID'd that this was somebody who had.
Sorry. What you're saying, sorry, man. What you're saying is that it's very rare for NORAD to actually shoot anything down. This is a very rare occurrence.
Very rare. Very, very unlikely that they would just go trigger happy on anything unless they've identified it.
Mario? No, this is the first time ever.
I believe since World War II. I could be wrong.
That's over American airspace. This is the first time ever.
Yeah. So
since
like
the creation of NORAD, since the creation of NORAD, these are the first incidents where we've had shoot downs.
I mean, let me give you. Can I give you guys an example to frame this in real world terms? On 9/11, when they were talking about like the third and fourth, and these were studies, scenarios we studied extensively on 9/11 they had, after the first two planes had hit, and they were talking about the third, fourth, and at one point maybe a fifth plane out there. They were trying to get authority. They had aircraft trailing them. They were trying to get shoot down authority, and at the time there was not really a clear ROE for that. And they finally decided that shoot down authority had on 9/11 had to come directly from the president, and they were not able to get that in time. They then changed it to where now it's SecDef, and then there are some appointees below him who have that domestic shoot down authority.
So,
And also, did you hold on? Also, did you just confirm as well what Grant and Emergent mentioned, that this is the first time NORAD has ever engaged?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this is the first time, and I think, but again, I'm going to just end up my comment. What I said earlier. I think again, the Chinese spy balloon, I think, and to Emergent's point, I think there was changes of the ROE, right? And NORAD has said, the National Security Council press secretary John Kirby said we don't know what it was. It was an object. It was not supposed to be there. It was entering U.S. territorial waters, and we shot it down, right? I think to Emergent's point that the Chinese spy balloon, we're all seeing the common record. They have changed their rules of engagement, and I think now the rules of engagement are, if this is an object that's not supposed to be there, and it's entering our territorial airspace, we're going to shoot it down, because I think they don't want a repeat of the Chinese spy balloon. And I think, unfortunately, and this might be now, are we going too much, right? Are we now being too public about this? Is there's too much discussion?
But also, quick question. Yeah. I've got two questions for you. So, Emergent Perspective did mention that for U.S. shoot down, for the shoot down to actually take place, they have to have a positive ID, and they have to identify the flying object to likely be hostile.
That's correct.
Right. And I think Emergent is 100% correct. But the question I have is, has there been a change of ROE based on the Chinese spy balloon instance to ensure that this has? So basically, you can have a positive ID, right? You can have a positive ID, and your positive ID is this object is none of the U.S., no Canadian, no civilian purpose. It is not supposed to be here. Has there been a change of ROE at directive of the President of the United States to now saying we have engagement authorities over this airspace? And by the way, the Canadian incident, right, with the shoot down in Canada, that came from the request of the Canadian Prime Minister, and they also said it was a cylindrical object or something like that.
So hold on. So also, if this is a request from the Canadian Prime Minister, doesn't that contradict the first point? And I'm just trying to be objective here, but doesn't it contradict the first point that it's the Biden administration changing the rules of engagement, or the Air Force or changing the rules of engagement based on the Chinese spy balloon? Now you've got the Canadian Prime Minister himself requesting for the UFO to be shot down, and he doesn't have any point to prove. He didn't make any mistakes with the Chinese spy balloon. Does that make sense?
No, the Chinese spy balloon went over Canada.
Oh, okay. So he's getting criticism for not shooting it down as well. So you think?
And so I think I think Emergent's 100% correct. Just as there was changes after 9/11, right? And he mentioned a perfect, delegation. That's what we call in the military, delegation of authorities at a certain level of SecDef, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And he's right. Generally a lot of these decisions are held at higher commands, and that's why they're generals and commanders and Secretary of Defense and POTUS, because they have higher levels of responsibilities that they can assume. The question I have, and I think this is a legitimate question, and maybe we might get an answer or not, has the Chinese spy balloon, just as 9/11, changed the rules of engagement? Has the Chinese spy balloon changed the rules of engagement? I think the actions are showing that there has been, and maybe this is a more recurring thing. And the question now that we have is that the right decision? Are we overreacting? And I think that's a legitimate thing that we have to look at.
I want to go to Emergent. Yeah, Emergent, I wanted to go to you. I want you to comment on what was just said. And do you think that this plays a role in the rules of engagement? Because again, I want to go back to a point you said. A positive ID is required, and the UFO must be highly likely to be hostile. Do you think that rules of engagement could have been changed within days after the Chinese spy balloon?
So we have seen, and they do occur from time to time, special ROE within NORAD airspace, because it's a very large command in response to particular situations. I can give you pretty common examples, or things like They can institute when major national events like the Super Bowl are going on, for example. They actually institute a special flight restricted zone around the Super Bowl stadium for any objects, and they can forbid some normal air traffic, and they can institute special ROE for scenarios like that. Presidential inaugurations are another example. Super Bowl, other things like that, where they identify a large or a significant chance of there being some type of event. But those types of special ROE are normally very focused around a specific event known ahead of time. They're normally very specific, very restrictive, and they're very temporary. They always go back to the main ROE, which have been the way that it has been really, for the most part, since NORAD's founding, because there's wisdom to those rules.
Okay, breaking 4 news. I know you have an update for us real quick, and then I do have another question for Emergent. So, breaking, jump in.
Yeah, we are getting some new reporting, and I want to point out the timing in this reporting, which is key. The governor of Montana posted a statement on Twitter just 25 minutes ago saying, quote, "I received a briefing tonight at the White House about an object in Montana airspace. I will continue to receive regular updates." So this was posted after the NORAD report where they said it was all clear and potentially a false alarm what was going on. So it's building on this kind of conflicting information that we're hearing from policymakers, lawmakers, and officials in the state of Montana versus NORAD and the communications that they've been providing to the American public. So it's obviously very easy to see that these situations could be like near misses, but at the same time, it's worth noting that it's just contributing to the confusion with this story.
Okay.
And I do have Joe as well just sent me some information that Air Force Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, I'll try to get him on. Oh, no, we're not going to be getting Ryder on, that's for sure. Stated that there was no indication at this point that it was maneuverable regarding the UFO that was shot down earlier, and that it had no, let me read the notes, and no indication that it had any surveillance equipment. But I just don't know what we could, what information we can trust, because we keep getting conflicting information, like the UFO above Montana. So it's hard to determine how accurate what Patrick is saying is.
Oh, I couldn't unmute. I'm sorry.
Nick, what's up?
I couldn't unmute.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, all good. All good.
So Emergent.
Brett,
what?
Go ahead, bro.
Okay. Emergent. I want to ask you real quick because you were involved with NORAD, and a big concern that people have had over the past week now that we've been tracking this, these UFO situations, a balloon and everything. Why was NORAD not able to pick up on where these UFOs came from? And how quickly should they be able to do it? How far off the coast of, say, Alaska are they actually tracking objects?
So that really depends on the specifics of the object itself. So as I said before, different objects have a different radar cross section. A balloon is going to have, for example, a much smaller radar cross section than like a Soviet MiG, right? So the general, to detect commercial aircraft and military type airframes, I mean, that capacity extends hundreds of miles out into the Atlantic and Pacific, also over the North Pole and Alaska. So generally for a solid object like we think of an aircraft, that's generally pretty broad and unlikely for something to slip in unnoticed. But when you get to odd shaped things, when you get to things like a flock of geese, again, those things can kind of pop up and be an anomaly and go away. There's also a tuning process on any system that is used for identification. There's something called ground clutter, which is if I have a radar that's placed somewhere near tall buildings, for example, I have to carve out places on the radar picture where it doesn't pick up the building and think that that's an object in the air, right? So buildings, trees, mountains, radio towers, things like that, and you normally have different. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure we're going to have more on that But I want to have Justin jump in here real quick before we go to the other speakers, because Justin, you actually have the clip where the U.S. congressman was on Fox News talking about the fact that he was briefed on the fact that there is a UFO currently over Montana. So if you could play that, that'd be awesome.
Let's play that real quick here.
And I guess my first question, have you guys been briefed on this matter?
I have finally, Lawrence. I will tell you that when the first balloon came across and everyone heard about it, we were clawing for information, and DOD, Pentagon was not forthcoming. Fortunately, this evening, I am back in Montana. I'm at an event, a Lincoln Reagan dinner in Columbus, Montana right now, and DOD called me as I've been sitting here and started giving me briefings to tell me what was going on. I clarified with them that this is actually the fourth balloon. Okay, so the first was shot down over the Atlantic. One was shot down before it entered into Alaska's airspace. Third was shot down, Trudeau ordered, over Canada. So now we're talking about a fourth incident. And we had air traffic shut down on the northern part of the state. My report is that it has been reopened. DOD told me that they are going to be tracking the object. They can't even say exactly what it is. They're going to track the object until it gets light again. They don't have the ability to put any more eyes on it with aircraft until it's light again.
Congressman, where is the object? Where is the object? Do they know where the object? I know you say they're tracking it, yeah, but where is it right now?
It's north of Havre, Montana.
So it's still in American airspace right now. So do we anticipate that airspace being closed as well? More airspace in the country in Montana being closed?
That I do not have any additional information on, Lawrence. I can tell you the airspace has been opened back up again. They closed it originally because the object was hovering there in that prime commercial air traffic zone between 18,000 and 35,000 feet.
And Congressman, I'm assuming because you represent this area, do they plan on shooting the object down?
I will know more as it gets light again, Lawrence. Right now, they cannot bring it down in the dark. And once it gets light again, they're still monitoring exactly where it's going. They will give me more information in the morning, or if anything changes through the evening.
So, Congressman, I know
that's the end of the clip there, but yeah, balloons all around. Then, huh?
See, did I hear that, Justin? Did I hear that right? Did he refer to them as balloons?
Well, he referred to the one over Alaska as a balloon, and then the one in Montana, he kept saying all they could do is refer to it as an object,
unidentified.
Right? Yeah.
But he did confirm that the one in Alaska was a balloon, because I did hear that as well.
Yeah, I think he confirmed that the one in Alaska was a balloon.
Confirmed or misspoke? I just want to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Who knows? Yeah, go ahead, Nick. Lots of confusion.
So it does seem that this interview happened after the airspace was reopened, because the original report by the DOD and the FAA was that or it was actually NORAD. I'm sorry, I'll correct myself. It was NORAD that said that there was an issue with a radar or whatever, so they were requesting that the airspace be reopened. But now that we're hearing this interview after the fact, it does seem like the congressman is pushing back on that. So, Austin, I want to bring you in here, and let's hear your thoughts on what you heard in the past few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, what's extremely clear is, especially considering the time of night, I should say, is that specifics on visual identification are going to be sparse. And what it appears to be is that the DoD is playing it a bit safe with that, which makes sense, right? Before you're going to order a shoot down of something, you should have visual identification of what it is. I'd love to hear Emergent's thoughts on this, because as he was sort of talking about earlier, you can have radar identification of something, but until you sort of send something up, take a look at it, you're not going to sort of give that issue to shoot that down unless you put the Canadian geese population at inherent risk. But I think what is clear is, as Allsource was talking about previously, is with all of the hoopla that the first sort of balloon incident sort of drove up in domestic media in the US and Canada, it makes sense that for one to assume that there has been a change in the ROE in regards to how NORAD deals with these incidents, as well as the strategy moving forward on whether they're to be monitored primarily and let go or shot down. And I think what we're seeing right now is sort of the after effects of this, because as Allsource also put quite clearly, UAPs are not a current issue. They've been going on for a while. And at the same time, from what we've seen from the United States government in particular, is we've actually seen a softening towards releasing information regarding UAPs. I'm sure many of you remember in 2021 when the administration declassified, I believe it was 27,000 documents on U.S. intelligence information regarding unidentified aerial phenomena that was started collecting in the 1980s. So I think what we're looking at right now is we're looking at a NORAD that is being far more transparent than it typically is on some things like this due to the amount of sort of public attention being put on it. But I would take that one step further. And when we look at sort of these incidences in general, and from what we've been seeing, it appears that these are other balloons, right? I think it's more likely than not, based upon the notes on lack of propulsion systems, the hovering tendencies. I think we're left with one of two things. Either they're balloons, they're being held aloft by a lighter than air device, or they are some sort of new technology that does not obey the laws of physics or the laws of aviation. And I think it's a safer bet to assume the former. I think the next step here, and this is something in particular I'd love to hear if he's still with us, or maybe bring him back up, Piotr's comments on if this is a continued balloon campaign. I think there's only one reasonable country we could point to on that, considering the past couple of weeks, and that would be the PRC.
Okay, so let me ask real quick. All Source, you were talking about that in order to shoot something down, that NORAD, the Department of Defense, would have to have positive identification, and Austin just referred to that as well. But when they're coming out now and saying that the origin is unknown, how can you positively identify an aircraft like that?
Actually, can you explain, Emergent? Can you explain what positively identifying would mean?
Sure. So what that normally means is, so for civilian or military aircraft, you typically have a transponder that actually identifies what it is, and anything not queued with an active transponder. So, for example, military aircraft have something called Mode 4, which is encrypted. So think of that like being like a police car with the lights on, meaning you're authorized to fly anywhere if you're squawking Mode 4. Mode 3 is civilian aircraft. That's your civilian airliners, and they have different codes that they're assigned based on the flight activity that they're currently exhibiting or the flight plan they have filed. And those codes match a certain behavior, such as landing at X airport or taking off, departing at Y airport. So the behavior of that aircraft, for example, has to match the transponder code that they have been assigned, and the behavior. They have to be flying within a certain limit of that. And if things go off course, then that becomes kind of a flag for people to start looking at. So ID usually comes down to, obviously the easiest way is transponders, then you have radar cross sections, and then your final is, as many people have alluded to, well, why wouldn't you shoot down something at night, is if something, your final line is visual ID. You can send, they can send Coast Guard helicopters or, F-16s or whatever's within range. They start looking at what they have in range to go intercept and do a visual ID. In the case of why wouldn't you shoot something down at night, if it's unidentifiable through other means, you would try to put an asset in the same airspace and visually identify it. In terms of, you would avoid a shoot down simply because you can't get a positive ID. Now, there might be an exception to that. For example, if we're talking about an object flying over the woods in Montana, it's not really, it's, again, we're defining hostile as certain behavior and certain intent, which gets to very complex definitions that we can't really go into here. But for example, it would be a different scenario if the object is unknown, unidentifiable because it's at night and it's hovering over some random woods in Montana versus it's approaching the state capitol building at a speed of 400 knots, right? Because then we're saying it is approaching a specific object or something of interest at a high velocity, right? So that's
Emergent. Let me ask you this as well, because this is a question that we're getting a lot from the audience, and I do want the audience to go down there in that bottom right-hand corner because we're going to be going here for a long time. I need your questions for the panel. But emergent, one of the most prominent things that people have been talking about since the first balloon was discovered is how were they unable to find these, to track these, to know exactly where they came from? Because we're talking about unknown origins now. Is the U.S. government not able to find out where these actually flew from? Because clearly they didn't come from, the areas that they were found in.
From my experience, to be honest with you, that just doesn't sound like a very likely scenario, because anytime an object enters U.S. airspace, there's a database that shows there's lots of data that is collected. It's including point of origin. You can go back and say, okay, this object's flying over, or close to New York City, and you can look at the track history over the last 8 to 10 hours and see, it entered U.S. airspace near Seattle, for example, or over the West Coast. So you can see track history, especially you can see transponder code changes, track history, altitude changes, any significant changes to a radar cross-section. There's a lot of data there, so I find it very unlikely that they would actually ever be in a scenario where we have no idea where something came from.
Emergent, would you say it's more likely that they're not, it's too early to start pushing blame to another country, and, this could cause geopolitical issues? So
Sure.
It's more likely that they know where these objects came from. It's just it's not it's not a good idea to start pointing fingers so early.
Sure, and I would also say it might be information they could have political reasons to want to suppress, right?
I want to mention that there was a report sent to me by Joao Santos, again, NPR report, titled I'll tweet about it in a bit. The Pentagon got hundreds of new reports of UFOs in 2022. It's a government report. And in that report, let me read out exactly what he said. Almost half of UFO reports are balloons or balloon-like. So, number one, is that common, or is that just recent from from what you've read? Because I know you haven't worked at the Air Force for about 8 years. So that's question number one. And question number two: is it possible that balloons, for the balloon to go over Canada for so long, is it possible that balloon was not spotted early, or do you think Canada spotted that first balloon relatively early and just let it go on for a while, just to observe, observe what it's doing, observe its direction, etc.?
So to the first part of your question, small balloons, even things like if something like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon got loose, right? Objects like that have gotten loose in U.S. airspace and have been tracked on radar. And they'll do reports for those things and make sure they know what it is. So it's actually not uncommon. Actually, probably the biggest development in the last 10 years is small civilian-owned drones, because those can create some. And again, we go to something like a national event like a presidential inauguration or a Super Bowl, where they do have serious concerns about somebody showing up with one of those drones and buzzing it into obviously airspace, it could just be some kid that wants to get pictures of the event, but then they have concerns about that. And so that scenario has become a lot more common in the last 10 years. Balloons have always been common. That's not a recent development. And I would say to the second part of your question, as the initial Chinese balloon, I suspect that the Canadian NORAD sections probably, and I haven't looked at the flight path recently, but wherever it entered NORAD airspace, they probably picked it up pretty early. Likely, if it came over the North Pole, they could have. There's massive amount of monitoring of that airspace, because that was always during the Cold War. That was always.
Why the sudden escalation now? Why suddenly now there's UFOs everywhere? And I know we've got other speakers that we just brought up. We'll go to you guys in a bit. But why suddenly now you've got all these UFOs being spotted and shot
I
down?
don't think it's an escalation necessarily, right? I think that this was a response to the public's anger at the fact that a Chinese spy balloon was allowed to fly over, American soil for 4 days straight without any kind of response. And so this is I would say it's a reaction to that, to hit it off at the pass, so to speak.
Actually, Ian, that sounds very credible to me. To be honest, hearing all of this, I think some people have gone crazy with the UFO alien stuff, and I don't think that's. I'm really not thinking there's a lot of credibility to that. But I do think it's quite likely. My best guess, and don't take me as obviously I'm not sitting in front of a radar screen, and I don't know all of this, but. Um, my best educated guess that I would put my money on is that they were probably running some kind of exercise or drill using drones, and it's gotten out of we know how the media is now with taking something and spiraling out with spiraling out of control with misinformation and narratives, and that's what this is to me until we really get strong confirmation otherwise. I think the likelihood of some unknown, I just from my experience, that's really pretty unthinkable that something we have no idea how or where this entered the airspace. Just not a credible story to me at all.
All source, you want to add to it?
When
Sorry, go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, before we go to all source, just last question for you, Emergent. What's your concern level right now out of 10? 1 being not concerned at all and 10 being extremely concerned. Where were you when the first balloon was shut down? Where are you at now? And what will get you to let's say an 8 or a 9? I don't think you're there already, unless you are.
I would say I was. I think I was listening to I think it was one of your spaces the other day with Dr. Gorka got up and said it comes across more like a publicity stunt on the part of the Chinese to do this for publicity and provocation reasons. Because they have satellites that can get more detailed imagery. I mean, unless there's some specific thing that the balloon could collect info on that otherwise, I'm really not too concerned. I think it's more of a publicity stunt. I think what's going on right now is probably more misinformation, but I mean, anything's possible, and I'm keeping my ear to the ground just like the rest of you. But my concern level right now is pretty low. I'm more concerned that disinformation and overreaction to it is where I'm at.
And you mentioned Dr. Gorka. He's in the. I've just sent him an invite, Dr. Gorka. If you want to come up, I've just DM'd you an invite. Oh, I've just sent you a request. And what escalation before we go to all source? What escalation would be like? Okay, shit. Now I'm at a 7 or an 8 concern level.
I would say a sighting, if something happened, within close proximity, if an actual hostile act was confirmed within close proximity to something that is of serious national security interests, like military base, major city, that type of thing, that's more where I'd be elevating my concern level.
Also, I know that Justin has a few clips to play for us before we go to Mr. Weinstein. Also, anything to add to what was mentioned by Emergent?
Yeah, so I think multiple things, right? I think there's a lot of ways that the U.S. can track stuff that is not only limited to radar. There's a lot of intelligence capabilities that we have that can synchronize and provide a better picture, right? So we're not just limited on radar. There's intel platforms that are very good at providing a clearer picture to see kind of what's going on. And that's kind of to back up to Emergent's point. I think from a term of escalation, et cetera, and if there's a concern, again, I think we just have to wait for more public information. I think the issue we're running into is that we're being, the U.S. government, NORAD, is being very public with everything that is going on, when a lot of the time these incidents probably wouldn't have just received that much publicity, and I think that's causing a lot of concerns. Again, we just don't know.
Hold on. What do you mean? Yeah. Just quickly, what do you mean they don't get that much publicity? If this is the first time NORAD ever engages, it's not something that happens.
But I think the China, again, just like I'm pointing there, the Chinese spy balloon changed the calculus to Emergent and Point. I think Emergent hit it again, because of the Chinese spy balloon incident. Now NORAD is being a lot more aggressive, and so as such is getting a lot more publicity. And when they're doing this engagements, they're publicly acknowledging it, right? Again, that's something else that is new, and I think the more publicity is maybe causing people to be more concerned. But one of the things we've seen is that the U.S. government has been public about this, and as such, I don't think they're trying to hide anything. And I think we just have to wait for a little bit more information to get a better understanding, because there's just too much unknowns.
I think he's right. And one thing I'll just point out is when they would run, for example, exercises in D.C., they would run, they would have, Civil Air Patrol pilots fly in and do a simulated type of engagement. And those types of things were actually published, and you can go find them yourself. Go do a search for DC ADIS, Falcon Virgo. They actually run these NORAD exercises in DC area. They actually run those exercises very frequently, and they publish them well ahead of time just to make sure that the public, if they see a Cessna with F-16s tailing it, flying in DC airspace, that nobody freaks out and calls 911 and thinks that something crazy is going on. So they do publicize things like that, and they actually do keep in mind that there is a public perception and that has to be managed. So that is another element to this.
Justin, before I go to Eric, I wanted to give you the mic to play some clips for us that you've got prepped.
Yeah, just real quick, here's a general trying to explain what happened.
The balloon was somehow able to get past our West Coast anti-balloon defense system, the Seattle Space Needle.
Oh, sorry. That was Keenan Thompson on SNL. Actually, one of the better jokes this week. Little levity just to bring in the real big guns. Now, this is retired General Anthony Tata. He's a Fox News contributor, but he also has some deep experience. This is his take just within the hour on what he thinks is going on here. He's talking about both the Alaska and Montana incident. Let's listen in.
Has addressed the American people about this very real threat to the United States. And it's been, you look at Twitter, and I agree with you, you have to sort of dismiss that because you just have all the information keyboard warriors there they dismiss this out of hand, like, well, you got satellites, why do they need to send balloons? You've really got to take a serious look at this and why China would be sending these balloons into our airspace. And, last week when we talked, Lawrence, I talked about probing the wire. When I was a commander in Afghanistan, the Taliban would probe the wire to see how you responded. They would send some new recruits in to cut the wire of your base camp, and your weapons would light up. And so they would pinpoint where your weapons were. At a strategic level, China is probing the wire to see how we respond.
I think that's a really interesting take. The analogy, I think, is apt there. They really do seem to be.
When was that? When was that, Justin?
This was just within the last hour. That was on the Dan Bongino show.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very good take, and I've most of the folks I know in the military right now, that's the general consensus right now.
And Justin, you got another clip as well?
Yeah, here's one more clip. This is the spokesperson for the Canadian Prime Minister talking about what they're doing next on this particular object, which was shot down.
Recovery operations are now underway and will be supported by the Canadian Armed Forces in conjunction with the RCMP. This coordinated operation will allow a further investigation into this object. We have no further details about the object at this time, other than it appears to be a small cylindrical object and smaller than the one that was downed off the coast of North Carolina. There is no reason to believe that the impact of the object in Canadian territory is of any public concern.
So that was her take on it. Again, it sounds like a balloon, but they keep, obviously for technical purposes, they refer to it as an object. Things are still being identified, but as we heard from the briefing that the congressman in Montana received, it sounds like these are balloons all the way down.
One question to Emergent before I go to Mr. Weinstein. You did mention that other people in the military that you've spoken to do believe that this is just China probing U.S. defense system. Is that what you meant?
Yes, I think probing probably more in terms of response to see what both politically how it's handled, but probably also just to see it's an opportunity for them to test capability. Wasn't this one of the first times that the F-22 was actually sent up and an AIM-9X was used on that? So for them, that's data collection, right?
That's ballsy. That takes some guts.
I mean, it's smart, right?
Eric,
intelligence, because there's no other way
it,
to
it,
actually get
I
that
don't know. I
information,
don't know.
because no one's ever used this
Yeah,
before. No one's ever used this before, and not in this sort of situation where they can directly probe the capabilities of the F-22. Thus far, the only thing we know about the F-22 is the stuff that the United States government itself releases, and they're not going to tell the world, much less China, what its capabilities are. So to see it in person, so to speak, it's a good way to gauge how powerful it is.
It goes to the question I had for you, Eric. Your thoughts on what's happening right now, and that, I was just in one of our groups right now. The team just sent me through an article by Military Times. National Guard preps for potential Arctic conflicts with Russia, China. Again, I'm not mentioning it to create fear or anything. I'm just reading out, some of the articles and the narrative we're seeing in the media. Would love your thoughts on all this, Eric. What are your thoughts on the escalation we're seeing? We saw that there's obviously the war in Ukraine that's escalating, and this NATO support to Ukraine, and now we're seeing escalating tensions with China.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I guess what I think is that we've settled into several new normals, which have not been really declared. I believe that the rules of engagement probably did change, and that we don't have a clear idea of how our outcry might have affected the political calculations of the commander in chief. In my opinion, what's happened is that we've settled into this new normal of preposterous statecraft narratives that might have been, I don't know, vaguely believable in a time before we were all able to communicate with each other, but no longer really get the trust of intelligent people thinking critically. So we don't really have a clear idea about the UFO UAP issue as regards non-human intelligence. There's this whole taxonomy that we forget in the first report, where 4 of the 5 branches are completely prosaic relative to the 5th branch, which is just called other. And the purpose of doing that was to make the sexiest thing sound the most banal. We also have this weird thing you can check in your mind, that when you hear the words UFO, you don't actually think UFO, you think flying saucer and aliens, when in fact it just means, as others have stated, unidentified flying object. And I would also say that there's sort of a limited number of shapes that most things are going to be configured in. They're going to be either configured in spherical shapes, or, sort of cylindrical, or wedges or whatever. And we all associate those with various grainy videos that we've been watching for ages on the alien front, wondering if these things are real CGI or a giant psyop. So I think what's happening is you're seeing a collision between all of these preposterous narratives, from the way that we're not allowed to question the Ukraine narrative, even though it involves nuclear conflict, and we're treating it as if it was an early 20th century war, in which we're going to back Putin into a conventional corner, because of course he could never do anything other than resign, which is not, it's a very bizarre thing. So when people are afraid that we're going to suddenly have this end to the calm that followed World War II, and that none of the narratives make sense, Kamala Harris is widely not thought to be capable of assuming the rigors of this job, and Joe Biden, may have competency issues, being over 80 and by far the oldest president we've ever elected. I think what you're seeing is that people are waking up to the idea that these presidential elections, which didn't seem to matter all that much, really matter. We may be in a completely different regime. And all of these trust-destroying statecraft narratives, which everyone can see are false, but nobody can get on the right channel to challenge. We're now aware that somehow we don't actually have news sources except for this crowdsourced stuff, and which is why there's so many people here. And so I think that that's what's happening, is that we allowed our government to continue doing what it had always done, but now in an era of social media where we can all compare notes, realize that they're lying, and that we now fear that none of this makes sense. And the last thing I would just close with is, it's completely irresponsible not to let us know that these objects were drifting with the air mass, right? So if you have a balloon, in many ways, it has very different characteristics than a jet or something like that, or a rocket. And as a result, somebody should just very quickly say that there is absolutely no sign of extraordinary physics with respect to these objects, so that we can simply shut down this thing that's in everybody's head, which is that we've heard way too much about really bizarre UFOs. And now we're in a situation in which we have a cylindrical object, which sounds like a tic tac or a cigar shaped object from days of yore. And I just think it's completely irresponsible for these governments, if they know these things to be relatively conventional, to not say something, because they must know everybody's going to speculate. Thanks very much.
I've got two questions for you, Eric. First, Emergent, I want you to comment on the last point that Eric made before I ask my two questions.
I'm sorry, I had stepped away for a second. Could you give me just a quick summary?
No, good. I'll do that in a bit. Eric, you mentioned the settling. We've settled to new normals. Can you elaborate on this point? Because I was going to ask you about it before you even started speaking, and that was the first thing you mentioned. What is this new normal?
Essentially, the new normal, so far as I can tell, is that the government embarks on some program that it claims is in our communal best interest. Many of us fear that it is in the best interest of the ruling class, because so many of our top politicians have become fabulously wealthy and we can't quite figure out what's going on. So we have a serious breach of trust because we think we have a principal agent problem where our agents, that is our elected representatives, don't represent us. And what they do is they say, we're going to embark on some program, for example, whatever the EcoHealth Alliance does in Wuhan, China, funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And none of us exactly understand what this news sources that used to give us a sense of sense making and analyzing these things are clearly playing on the side of the government. So effectively, what you have is that the referees are clearly on the side of one team, where the public feels, how did this country by for and of the people slip away from us? And the result of allowing these narratives that don't make sense to accompany very dangerous and very bizarre actions that can be seen by all is this radical erosion of trust, where people want to lump them all together. Many people think that what's going on with these shoot downs, for example, they're writing to me saying, this is because we're about to get the Epstein list and that we need a massive distraction. And you'll hear people say, oh, that's a controlled opposition, that's a limited hangout, useful idiots. We've all adopted the PSYOP level where we're armchair amateur defense spooks, where we're trying to say, oh, you're so stupid that you believe that, because nobody knows what to believe, because our media is continuing with the same way that they used to present things, but in an era where we can compare notes, and now we know that they're absolutely lying.
I want to ask you one more question. I know there's some more news to share. One more question, Eric. The other new normal that I wanted to comment on as well is the geopolitical normalcy that we're seeing. We've got I was just researching the Nord Stream explosion that happened a few months ago, because we're doing a space on it in a couple of weeks. And you've got the Ukraine conflict. You got Zelensky was in was it? I can't remember which country he was in, and he was urging a few European nations to provide, or NATO to provide jets to Ukraine. Obviously, we've got Russian nuclear readiness on the rise. That was increased a few months ago. And now you've got China potentially probing US capabilities, defense capabilities, and their political response with the balloons. And that was the point that Emergent was making earlier. This is for me, this is the story that concerns me the most at the moment. And how we're seeing an escalation among the three superpowers in our world. Does that particular point concern you? Should it concern the financial world? Should it concern the world? Or this is just political bickering and nothing to be worried about?
I don't know why you're stopping at 3. I mean, I'm worried about the India-Pakistan border, what Iran is going to do next. And the concern is that the more thinly we are stretched, particularly by sending arms and things, the greater the probability that opportunists will increase the number of theaters. And because a highly nonlinear situation where you have multiple theaters in play, and what happens in one affects what happens in the other. This is where I don't understand the isolationist perspective, because these oceans that the U.S. is protected by are not going to function in a modern world the way they might have functioned in the 1700s. I'm absolutely convinced that it's not three superpowers, but you're talking about a multipolar world where the U.S. is fatigued. It's retreating from the responsibilities of maintaining a world with as few poles as possible after World War II, because we're all just sick of the job. And we're going to be reminded that what we've lived through is the most anomalous era of peace and relative calm, save some horrible things that happened a long time ago in China in the Great Leap Forward. We are completely unprepared for what it means to live on this planet with the toys that we've come up with. And I absolutely think the worst thing that can happen is that the number of theaters goes up to 5 or 6, and we're going to be punch drunk where we can't see straight.
I remember the narrative of the hope that we would never face a world war again, thanks to globalization and the interconnectedness of the world. And that narrative seems to be crumbling every month for the past few months. And this doesn't help. So do you think that we'll see any economic impact from these escalations, or it's too early to see such impact?
I think you're going to. I hope that the worst of our concerns is an economic impact. I'm really just thinking that most of us have an idea that if something hasn't happened in 20 years, then it's never going to happen, and if something has never happened, it's not worth worrying about. And I really think that history is going to be restarting this century in earnest, and we're completely unprepared as humans for what that actually looks like.
Justin, I know you had a quick clip you wanted to play for us before I continue with more questions. Then we'll go to Austin just for a quick update. And we'll go actually to Mateus for a quick update on any developments. Justin?
Yeah, going back to General Tata, he's going to basically just talk about kind of what his perception is of how, again, I think what Brett alluded to, some of the administration lapse here. Hang on one second.
We still haven't heard anything from the president of the United States. And apparently Lucas is the only one that's on the White House lawn to give us some information.
Right. Yeah, hey, Lawrence, Lucas does a great job. And, as he was talking, it occurred to me that recall that during the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle, the entire administration was on vacation. You had Blinken in the Hamptons. You had the president at his place in Delaware. Everybody was on vacation as this happened. And then, and there was zero communication with the American people. Then when the Ukraine-Russia war was about to begin, the administration offered Zelensky a ride out instead of taking a whole look at what's happening there, because their intelligence was so bad that they thought it was going to be over in 72 hours and Russia was going to own Ukraine. And now they're not communicating. We have a repeated penetration of U.S. sovereign airspace by an adversary that's listed in the National Defense Strategy as our number one competitor in the world. And the president's at a party, and there's zero communication with the American people.
I think that's a valid critique. There's, I think people really want to mirror the sort of they want from their government to mirror that sort of anxiety and anxiousness they have around these things. More communication, more information, I think, will be vital for that. And I think it'll dissipate a lot of the tension that people feel. I mean, look, we got 18,000. I think at one point we hit 20,000 people listening to this live. That's one of our biggest shows ever, and it's pretty impactful. I think if you kind of are just tuckered away at and dining with people at these different events around the country. Gosh, I think a lot of feedback I'm getting is people really need to get on the ball and communicate what is actually happening here.
And before I continue asking questions, and for the audience members, anyone that just joined, bottom right corner is where you can ask questions. And Mateus, can you give the audience an overview of what we know so far? What are the facts that we know so far? Mateus?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm here. Basically, what's been developing this afternoon and this evening is that a third unidentifiable object was shot down in a joint military operation by the U.S. and Canada over Canada, specifically over the Yukon. That's the portion of Canada that was affected by this. We know via a Wall Street Journal report citing U.S. sources familiar with the situation that this was in fact a quote metallic balloon with some sort of a payload underneath it. We don't. Those are the details that have been confirmed on the Canada situation, but not necessarily confirmed on the situation that we have on the coast of Alaska, which was downed Friday afternoon. Additionally, what's occurring tonight, which has created a very confusing situation, is that several hours ago, we heard reports of fighter jets being scrambled on our west coast. And then we had the FAA issue a NOTAM and a airspace closure over Montana, which within about an hour of that issuance was retracted and all operations were resumed. Now, during that time, we had lawmakers who represent Montana, both senators and congressmen and women, as well as the governor of Montana, specifically saying that they were briefed on another object that's unidentifiable over Montana airspace, and that due to the fact that this was discovered at night, the military cannot take further action and will resume their operation in the morning. However, we then received contradicting information from NORAD, which said that this was basically a false alarm and a radar-triggered abnormality that they investigated and then pulled back their operation based on the fact that nothing was found. So it's a very confusing situation with a lot of dynamics. Obviously, we're at a heightened state of alert given the situation last week with the Chinese spy balloon downed off the Carolina coast in the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the discovery that that balloon wasn't the first, it wasn't the second. There were several, and it's part of a much larger campaign by China to spy on countries throughout the world. So clearly, we're all at a heightened state of readiness, a heightened state of alert, and that's why we see an uptick in this
Mateus,
situation.
one more question. One more question. I see Nick
Absolutely.
unmuting, so I'll give him the mic in a bit. One more question to you, and then we'll go to Rose Alerts as well, who's been covering the story with us. Mateus, the question to you is: there were reports of more balloons that were spotted around the world, including Latin America, over the last few days. Can you give us a bit more context there?
What I can confirm for you is that at the same time as we were dealing with our balloon, the final days, as it was kind of in the southeast United States and then off our coast where it was down, is that Costa Rica was dealing with a similar balloon. And then the Pentagon later confirmed earlier this week that 40 countries have reported, not all at the same time, but in general, this kind of campaign by China with these surveillance balloons, and there's been several of them.
Okay, so I'm gonna. Your mic is a bit muffled, Mateus. Rose alerts. Anything that Mateus missed? Anything you'd like to add before I ask another question for Emergent? And I see we've got OSINT Defender on stage as well. But go ahead, Rose alerts. Anything to add that Breaking 4 News missed?
No, he did an excellent job. I'm just checking through the feed if there's any new updates or anything like that. But yeah.
Appreciate you both. Just a massive shout out to you both because you've been feeding us all the information and validating any information that we get before we share it on space. So appreciate you. Nick, I want to ask one more question to Emergent, and I'll give you the mic, Nick, if you don't mind. Just one more question. Emergent, we've had. So from no one talking about balloons, no one knowing anything about balloons, to suddenly a balloon appearing in the US and being shot down, to now there's balloons all around the world, or at least being reported around the world by 40 countries, as Mateus just mentioned, and now we're seeing the UFOs in various locations in the US. My question here is, did the Air Force, did the intelligence know all this beforehand, and we're only finding out in recent days? Or is it possible that after spotting that one balloon, I know I kind of touched on that question earlier, after spotting that one balloon and shooting it down about a week ago, that now there have been paying more attention to objects that fit that description. And now we know that there's more Chinese spy balloons in the different locations, including Latin America.
I just wanted to say that is very possible that during different events, like I said, high profile national events like Super Bowl or presidential inauguration or anything that might indicate a heightened security state, they do sometimes elevate the posture. They also can change standing orders. Usually those things are short term and temporary, but it's not impossible that some kind of elevated stature or the added publicity could cause, I wouldn't say, I don't think it would be very likely that anybody would go trigger happy because there's too many safeguards in place to prevent that, but maybe alert happy might be a better term. So, for example, people might be more likely to, report a radar anomaly, for example. And like we said, that can be many things. That can be clutter. That can even be systems that, for example, normally a track is correlated on multiple radar sources before it appears as part of an air picture to make sure you don't have a glitch on one system. So, I mean, things like that could be, there could be heightened awareness because of the publicity surrounding this. Also, as I said, there can be things like exercises. And it could even be it could even be that another unit is doing an exercise that NORAD wasn't really strongly briefed on that they could have an overreaction to. That's also a possibility.
The question I want to go to Adam on this question as well, guys. For this, I don't know how serious is it that this is the first time NORAD ever engages? Because Emergent, you were pretty relaxed earlier that you weren't too alarmed by these developments, and you think this is just China probing U.S. defense capabilities. But for NORAD to engage for the first time, why wouldn't they? After the Chinese balloon and China being very apologetic and unusually apologetic before the U.S. shut it down. Why, if there are these unidentified objects, including that balloon up in Canada that was shut down earlier today, that metallic balloon, why would NORAD engage rather than communicate with China and say, "Hey guys, you got all these balloons here. We shot one down. You gotta get your objects out of our airspace." I know we're just assuming that this is China, but this is speculation we can make considering what we know.
Maybe it's not Chinese.
Adam.
Well, I'd say NORAD wouldn't really be the one to handle the diplomatic angle there. They're really more of a.
But wouldn't NORAD need some authority before shooting down a UFO in unidentified
Yes, that is
flying
absolutely
object?
correct. Positive ID, hostile declaration, and
hostile and that hostile declaration. Can you define it again, especially for people that just joined? So hostile declaration is required for NORAD to engage. So
correct.
Can you give us examples of hostile declarations? Serious ones, obviously, and ones that are not too serious, but that would still count as hostile declaration for them to be shut down.
So normally, if something enters U.S. airspace and it's unidentified, it would normally be treated as unidentified or unfriendly, and they would try to make a positive ID. Normally, hostile declaration would only come after they've positively identified it as a hostile aircraft and/or with hostile intent. Or, for example, if something were to commit a hostile act, some aggressive things might qualify, such as painting another aircraft with targeting radar under certain circumstances, firing a missile, or flying into restricted airspace without authorization. It's a series of criteria, and it's not really a one-dimensional thing. But typically, it requires an actual hostile act or demonstrable hostile intent before that would be declared. It's a pretty stringent criteria.
Yeah, Adam, I want to go to you quickly. Like, why again? If I want to speculate that this is a Chinese UFO, Chinese balloon, with the intention to spy, why would NORAD engage? Why wouldn't, after what happened with the Chinese balloon a week ago? Again, I'm speculating here that it is Chinese, and maybe I should stop doing so. Adam, tell me if I should. What your thoughts are? But if it is Chinese, why wouldn't China just get their flying objects out of the U.S. airspace? And the reason I'm asking these questions, I want to know how concerned should I be in? And it just, for me, it would sound concerning that after their balloon was shot down, they still have flying objects over the US and Canada. It just shows that the audacity they have is very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, China has shown a flagrant disregard for other countries' sovereignty in the past. But like part of the reality with these balloons, which are largely being carried by the current, is the air currents, is that they are unguided, right? They can't necessarily be retrieved by foreign power. They don't probably even
This,
have a transponder.
but
But
this is a weird. Why would I'll let you continue? But why would they be unguided? Again, Emergent mentioned that it's relatively easy for defense air system or air defense systems to spot unidentified flying objects or anything within the U.S. airspace. So knowing this fact, why would any country have balloons that they cannot maneuver? And again, Joao Santos did send us an article confirming, or I can't remember what it was, but we did confirm earlier that the flying object that was shot down in Canada also did not have maneuvering capabilities.
right.
So why would they do that?
Well, it would basically reduce its ability to be detected, right? These things, at least the first balloon that we know of that was shot down off the coast of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, was flying at up in above 60,000 feet at various points of time. It wasn't really being sought after. It's not a conventional method of espionage, and these are quite obviously probably cheaper than throwing a satellite up into space to do some of the same the surveillance, right? So they're putting it through the air currents, knowing that because of how the winds work up at those altitudes, it will cross over a large swath of important parts of the United States, and they have some limited ability to self-guide while they're up there. And I think that's very critical to understand. And it raises two very important questions. One is, where are these being launched from, right? I don't know very much about wind currents up at that altitude, but I can't foresee them being launched from mainland China. And I think someone mentioned earlier possibly the North Pole. And number two, the other question, other than antagonizing the United States, and this is something that's been speculated about before, is what is the actual Chinese ability to do imagery and signals intelligence collection from the United States? And just given their inability to put satellites into space at the kind of the rate that the United States has been able to do so, for military purposes, it actually seems to me that this is actually becoming a primary way that they're looking to expand their collections on the United States. To me, I actually think these are legitimate attempts to collect on the United States. And not only are those things a hazard to the U.S. national security, but also the fact that they do periodically cross into air traffic lanes actually causes them to be a danger to normal commercial transit. Okay, Osing, jump in here. Welcome to the stage. Maybe.
Austin Defender, you there?
A little note while they're coming up, just to show you kind of how ahead of the game we are, or maybe we're the only ones who are really interested in this topic. CNN has moved on. They have playing the history of sitcoms. MSNBC is doing a special on immigration and the challenges that lawyers face. And even Fox News moved on to the fight around New York and Florida.
But why? So this is that's weird. Like, yeah, but why? Am I missing something? Because this is the first time NORAD ever engages. We're seeing an escalation of hostilities between when the last Chinese balloon was covered nonstop and it was all over the news. Now suddenly you've got another one shot down in Canada and one over Montana that they're waiting to shoot down tomorrow morning. That's why I was asking the questions earlier to Adam and Emergent, just to understand how serious this should be taken. I'll try to find Piotr and bring him up because it'll be good to get his perspective on this. But otherwise, Austin Defender, I saw you were able to unmute. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
No, I'm just saying it's a little pathetic. I just posted to the Nest this video that's on TikTok making the rounds from some Chinese account. Basically, they mocked up the F-22 trying to go after the balloon, and the balloon evading all its missiles and everything else there. I mean, I think part of it is it's probably on the whole, as you step back, a little frankly embarrassing right? This entire endeavor that we're all up in arms over these balloons. But I think a lot of us in the know here, and a lot of great experienced speakers on stage now, they've conveyed that this is a premise to something probably quite larger, and that it should be taken seriously. But I think the main networks don't quite know how to handle it.
I would actually disagree on that, on multiple points, right? If you're looking at what CNN, what Fox, what MSNBC is covering, I think we've actually well established that, and I think we've had an issue over the last hour or so. I think we've been jumping so quickly from point to point, we haven't been able to conduct sort of proper analysis on each one of these things. If you're looking at it from the perspective of a major news organization, right? I think we've all established that there's been a change in the ways that the DoD and the government has addressed these sorts of incidents as a result of the sheer amount of public attention that's being put on them. Mario, as you mentioned, this is the first case of a NORAD shootdown over not just the continental United States, but in the area that is under NORAD. And I think a large thing that has to do with that has to be based upon public attention. So I think it's very clear, but also, if we want to talk about sort of like breaking updates and everything like that, I think we've also sort of well established that, what was the cause of the shoot downs over Alaska and the Yukon in Canada. We've established what's the situation ongoing right now in Montana. And so I think it would be actually irresponsible of, MSNBC, Fox, CNN, and so on and so forth to continue running, end to end, sort of, we've got a camera looking into the night sky in Montana and this, everything, right? Because what would that do? That would drive panic. But there are a couple of other points I really want to touch on. Number one, I think this issue in particular, if it is the PRC behind it, is almost entirely dependent upon U.S.-China relations and what we've seen, not just over the past 2 weeks, but over the past 6 months. I think it has little, as we heard some previous speakers talk about, the war in Ukraine. I think it has little to nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. I think it has little to nothing to do, if it is the PRC, with what's been going on in the past 2 weeks with Israel and Iran. I don't believe the Chinese legitimately think that the United States' involvement in other world affairs is their chance to fit a balloon through our integrated air defense network. That's simply not how these things run. But moving forward, and another point I'd like to say is that, it was posited that the first balloon was a way to sort of look into the F-22 system and get sort of data on that. There's nothing, to my understanding, that could have been grabbed from that balloon that the Chinese would not have been able to get through either, number one, their actually quite extensive human intelligence network, number two, their even further extensive signals intelligence network, or something that isn't sort of already public on the F-22 system itself. What's secret about the F-22 is not its, the altitude at which it flies, nor the speed at which it flies, nor the weapons that it carries. What's secret about it is what makes it stealthy. It is the specific sort of compounds that are put on that aircraft that allow it to evade radar detection. That is the biggest thing with the F-22. And there's nothing that I've seen so far in regards to any sort of equipment that could have been put on a Chinese balloon that would have been able to determine a compound of that nature. So I'm extremely sort of apprehensive to this notion that this is like a long con by the PRC. They're actually getting more out of a balloon with a couple of cameras and some other sort of sensors, whether that's SIGINT or it's based on image intelligence. On the F-22 platform, I think it was more so just, the Air Force decided that the F-22 was the best system for that. And also, the Air Force has been sort of pumping up the image of the F-22 since its introduction in 2005. And so I think it looks good for the United States to use a platform like that. I think what's more so the case is because of the publicity of that initial balloon. We've seen a change in how the DoD is dealing with this. We're seeing more transparency than normal and more updates that the public just generally isn't used to from an organization such as NORAD. And I'd like to hear Emergent comment on that point particularly. And as a result of that, we are seeing more of these cases of, eventually resulting in a change of ROE to shoot downs.
It's interesting to point out that when the Chinese balloon was first identified, like last week, it was almost immediately identified by the US government as a Chinese spy balloon. With these 3 incidents today and yesterday, we're not seeing that identification as being Chinese. So there's
Yeah,
a
but
distinct
Keegan, what's the
possibility it's not
major
even
difference
Chinese.
between no? What's the major difference is that the Chinese recognized it as their own balloon publicly, right?
Yeah, they did.
You know,
Yeah.
you can fly up. Hang on. You can fly up and look at a balloon and say that's a balloon, but until that thing is brought down, or unless there's a giant PRC flag on the side of the balloon, it's actually quite difficult unless it's already a previously identified airframe to put that towards a specific country. If I fly a Cessna 152 over Canada and put nothing on it, there's no reason the Canadian government would believe that that's an Iranian Cessna 152 unless they bring that thing down and there are specific elements of that equipment that are inherently Iranian. That's why the major difference between the Chinese balloon last week and what we're looking at right now is the fact that the Chinese government recognized it as their own.
So before we go to Emergent, because I definitely want your feedback on this, Alex, you've been paying a lot of attention to this story. I've seen you've been tweeting all day about it. What's your overall opinion on what you've seen today and the administration's response, the DoD's response?
Hey, so what I'll say is it's pretty interesting. I think Mario picked up on this. I've been like half paying attention because I was at dinner. But we went from experts like Adam Kinzinger, self-proclaimed experts on this type of stuff, saying that these things are unmissable, that they're too high. Well, the first one at least. And then the next day they ended up shooting it down. And also how that was unprecedented. And then at the same time, they're like, oh, this is very normal. We have these things, over our heads all the time. We just don't hear about it. And like Mark Milley and like the military saying, oh, we just don't report it to the public unless, there's a reason for them to be like alerted. And now, like we've seen in the past week, we're seeing multiple, and we have another shoot down, and then a potential what we had tonight could have been another shoot down, but they were saying it's too dark. It could be a shoot down tomorrow morning if they confirm that. How like very quickly it's changed from it's very unprecedented, and we want to make sure that like it's going to pose risk to civilians before we take any sort of action. It could be seen as like an escalation towards foreign power. But now we're on the verge of potentially shooting down a third one. It's just very interesting to me how we went from this is normal, it's all like, we're seeing this all the time, to now in a week we've seen 4 possibly, and we're almost going to have 3 shoot downs. That to me is just very odd. And then also tonight, how we're having, we had that statement come out saying that was like a false alarm, but then we're having a congressman on live TV saying that he just got off the phone with DoD, and they're saying that's not the case. They're saying that they did see an object and that they cannot make a shoot down in the dark, and they're going to track it throughout the night and wait until the morning. So, like, all of this is very strange, and I'm confused as to why we're seeing conflicting information from the DoD briefing a congressman, and let me see the organization who put out the statement. I did tweet it.
It was NORAD, the FAA.
Yeah, NORAD, and yep, U.S. Northern Command. Yep. So that's just my observation from past couple days. And then the other thing too, I'll say is, like the first balloon, they wouldn't have addressed it had the public not asked about it. And on Friday, yesterday, they weren't even going to tell the public about it. I don't think they were asked about it. So that like raises some questions, because they're only telling us when the public is asking about these
things. Do you think, Alex, this has gotten a little bit political now? Is that what you're saying? That it seems like maybe the administration is acting based on politics?
Yes, and I've had a bunch of comments about like the Trudeau shooting down. They're like, now I feel like this is like a PR thing, because it's like, now they're like, oh, me, like Biden, it's like, oh yeah, me and Trudeau are like protecting, North America's skies together, blah, blah, blah. We're taking quick action on these things. When, like I just said, like the last one, we're like, oh, we have to be very careful, and we're not going to shoot it down because it might hurt people, or we might be like seen as provoking a war or whatever. And like, we can let it like float over our entire country for 3 days and did nothing about it. And now we're seeing people like almost take decisive action 2 in 1 day. And then like literally a week ago, they're saying, oh, this happens all the time. We just don't tell the public about it. So it is a PR thing, I think. And they just want to like overcompensate and say, oh, yes, this we're tough on this stuff. But like I said, like if they're saying it's common, it's just very confusing to the public.
And that goes, Mateus. You sent me a political article that said the same thing, Mateus. Do you want to mention it to the audience? Is Mateus with us, or he dropped out? He dropped out. Yeah. No, he just dropped out. I'll DM it, but I'll read out the article. He's just messaging me now, but I'll read out the articles from Political. Asked why there were seemingly more balloon downings and related incidents, a U.S. official said, quote, "We are being more vigilant now," which is in line with what Alex and Emergent said. I'm not sure if Austin, you said the same thing. That there isn't more sightings. The response is just more aggressive now, considering what happened with the Chinese balloon. So just wanted to mention that as well. But we'll go to Olsen Defender, who's been here for a while. How are you, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. Sorry, got a bit of a sore throat this evening. I did want to mention really fast that the Canadian military has apparently figured out what was shot down over their country, but they are refusing to announce what it is. So that I think that's rather interesting, and it definitely shows either that they don't want us to know, or they still don't know, and that they're just trying to make people think that they know what it is.
It's interesting. Yeah, if you can send me through any article or clips, I'll get Justin to play them. Captain, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of information to kind of sift through there in the last 45 minutes. Austin brought up some good points about the capabilities of the F-22 and what we choose to allow the bad guys to see when it happens. We can circle back. Alaska Elmendorf Air Force Base has what we call a combat alert cell, and that's basically, we see it a lot in the news when Russia, as we like to say, probes the wire, right? They send their Tu-95s over to our ADIS, tries to poke around, and then we send our F-22s up there to basically, tell them you're not wanted over here. Well, the thing about our F-22s, when we send them up over there, is we put our wing tanks on them. And what those wing tanks do is it completely eliminates the stealth characteristics of the aircraft. So if China was trying to somehow figure out how are they making these things stealth in these compounds that Austin was mentioning, I haven't seen any pictures of the aircraft that shot down whatever it was today, but I would bet that since they're coming out of that Alaska area, they would have those tanks installed, which would limit the ability for China to try to gather up any intelligence or any capabilities. So that's just something to really keep in mind. That's how they conduct those interceptions all the time. And I would be shocked if Russia didn't leak or share the information that they've gathered from our intercepts of what our response is. And we see when it happens, it's politicized on the news for about an hour, and then that's really the last that we hear of it. And now we have this going on, and it seems that it's getting a lot of traction very quickly.
Justin, you do have a clip from an eyewitness of the Montana UFO?
Brian Kilmeade has gone into his Super Bowl rants, but he broke real quickly just a few minutes into his program, played a taped segment with the pilot of a general aviation aircraft who spotted the balloon over Montana. Let me get this here.
To get us out of this mess. What I gleaned from the whole balloon calamity after calamity is the need for people to take the lead, citizens. After all, it was a average citizen in Montana who spotted the surveillance ship.
Oh, I think this is the first one. Sorry, but this is interesting. Just hear this out real quick.
Who called the journalist. Our president would not have acted without that proof.
As I was gathering my things, I just spotted this circle in the sky, and I knew it was something that was kind of out of place.
Chase told me where it was, so I had some long telephoto lens with me, and I got out of the car and started taking pictures of it. I put together all the pictures that I had taken and started sending them to the FAA and the governor's office, and they eventually put me in touch with NORAD.
Yeah. So again, that's an interesting take in that this really wasn't going to be a big issue altogether. And I've heard other clips on other shows talk about how this has been happening a lot. It happens all the time. It got called out, and then it blew up into this national scene. And I think this guy is right. It's only going to be the sort of pressure that we put on as citizens to really press them on, how what is the import of all of these things flying over our heads on this piece, right? So let me find a few more clips, but that's just what I have right now. Again, the shows have all turned to Super Bowl coverage now, so that'll be the blanket spot for most of the networks for the next 24 hours until someone gets a good shot of a shoot down again. And there are videos that are purported to be the shoot down in Alaska, and maybe they say in Montana too. But again, so speculative. We'll just have to kind of keep playing around and see what we find there.
Yeah, I've been getting similar videos as well. Haven't tweeted them because it's just impossible to verify. So that I wish I could, but
There's
I'll get a lot of hate for that.
Going out to one person sent me a satellite falling and claiming it was the unknown object over Montana. So it's just a lot of fake videos going out right now. So
And you saw the same thing with the balloon. But by the way, how was the coverage, Roosevelt? How was the coverage of the balloon that was shot down a week ago relative to the balloons that we're seeing now? How are you seeing both stories being covered by mainstream media?
I feel like it's the same, really, unless I haven't really watched the news that much. But I'm seeing a lot of the same reactions what we had last weekend. So, but yeah.
So I just kind of couldn't unmute. So I'll give you the mic, Nick, for a bit. Let me just bring up. We've got two special guests coming in, so let me organize with the team in the back end to bring them up.
Okay. Let me ask you this, Adam, if you're still around. Obviously, we do have some conflicting reports when it comes to whether there was an object in the sky. You've got NORAD saying one thing. You've got a U.S. congressman saying the other another thing. And, being that you did work in D.C. for a while, what kind of briefings do these congressmen get? Are these classified briefings? Is he even supposed to be talking about this?
So I can't imagine that he was receiving any sort of particularly classified information. And this is literally an example of a game of telephone, right? And I'm not saying that he's incorrect here, but, the lag time between what he gets told and what is the current information on the ground may be different from what the press secretary actually is coming out. So we're basically in the same position as if neither side had made any public comments that we still don't really know. We won't know till tomorrow morning when there's going to be more clarification about the status of this unknown object in the sky. Most members don't really get. Most members won't get that kind of detailed analysis that the Defense Department appointees and bureaucrats would be getting right now.
Right, but being that he is still going on news networks, he's still on Twitter, he's still pushing this. Does it even seem realistic that NORAD might be, maybe being disingenuous at the order of, say, the Department of Defense? Because as Alex said, this might be getting a little bit political. Does that seem, the realm of possibility?
I think so. I think it's very interesting too. The governor of the state, Gianforte, came out and actually made a statement as well about some communications that he had with the White House regarding this situation. And his statement on Twitter, I had to pull it up and throw it up in the jumbotron. But he really. His statement was very political. He was very expressed a lot of frustration with the lack of information he was receiving from the White House about what was going on. And I think that's actually pretty par for the course right now. Is that there isn't a lot of information being going on right now, and the representatives and leadership of the state are kind of in the dark here. And NORAD hasn't been very clear about what was happening in the skies and whether or not there's still an object up there. However, given the fact that they did clear the space again, the airspace, it it makes me want to ask: was there something? Is there still something possibly up there, or is there something not up there? I'm not really sure. I don't know what was done to cordon off the area at night when the first balloon was transiting the United States. My chief concern is, how does this potentially impact civilian air travel? Going back and forth over the state.
Right. So Emergent, I'm going to yield to you on that as well, and sort of a similar question there. Would NORAD open up airspace, or I'm sorry, the FAA open up airspace and revoke that National Defense Airspace designation, that TFR, if they actually thought something was in the air up there at potentially 40,000 feet? It's probably worth making a distinction here that 40,000 feet and 60,000 feet, it's a huge difference. The 60,000 feet, you don't see commercial air traffic at. So that's definitely worth noting. But what are your thoughts?
Sure, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there are altitude ceilings beyond which they either consider something to be a diminished or a non-threat. Because, for example, at some point something is in space, and we're not considering that U.S. airspace. But there are a few flight restricted zones that are actually defined as, if you will, 0 to infinity airspace. So there are a few. Normal airspace does have a ceiling, which they care, but there are a few things within NORAD protection that are considered infinite altitude. They consider anything over it would be in violation.
Interesting.
I want to go quickly to Mateus. Mateus, I've just got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind, man. When were Americans told about the first balloon?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question because we know that President Biden was briefed first on this situation on the 31st of January. I was actually with the president covering his trip to New York City about the infrastructure bill, but journalists did not notice anything kind of awry and unusual about his visit or any times he was maybe pulled aside or anything like that. We were made aware, obviously, after it was revealed on social media that there was something over Billings, Montana. So it's interesting to think about whether or not we would have been made aware of this had this not have broken on social media and gotten the traction that it did. What makes matters worse, possibly for the administration, is that on Friday, when John Kirby, who's recently taken the position as the White House coordinator for strategic communications, gave a briefing as part of the daily press briefing at the White House, he didn't reveal the information forthcoming that the second object was shot down over Alaska within the hour of him speaking. He had to wait for a reporter to kind of ask him, is something going on over Alaska? We're hearing unconfirmed reports of military activity. And then he pulled out this piece of paper and read off a statement. So again, kind of going towards the fact that we don't necessarily know if the administration would even reveal this kind of information if it weren't for the media and then with the earlier Chinese balloon, the public and their reporting on social media.
I'm just going through the audience questions. I've got another question here for you, Mateus. The way this was all communicated, because I know you keep covering breaking news on a regular basis. The way this was communicated, is it surprising? Or because I know I saw a few panelists earlier mention their concerns in the conflicting reports. But I just don't find that to be too surprising. I find it to be relatively common. They can't share everything instantly. And when there's breaking news happening, it's really difficult. Everything's dynamic, so it's really difficult to know what to share. Should we make something out of that lack of clarity that we're seeing, or is that relatively common?
No, that's why I'm being so careful what I'm doing, because it's obviously important to call out administrations over lack of transparency because we want the American public to know everything. But at the same time, you understand the importance of military secrecy to some extent, where when things like this occur, you almost want your own military to not share everything, because they're not just sharing with the American public, they're sharing with the world. So you don't play all your cards at once, but at the same time,
Yeah.
if John Kirby had a prepared statement to make, he should have led with that instead of waiting for a reporter to ask, because it doesn't look good for the administration, regardless of what his intentions were.
Austin, I want to go to you, man. We've covered, and you've been in our space on the Ukraine war. We've covered Chinese-US tensions in a space together as well. The escalation that we saw, again, is it fair, Austin, to speculate that this is Chinese, either spy balloons or spy flying objects, spying UFOs?
Yeah, I would say so. I wouldn't say when we look at other near peer adversaries of the United States that would have the capabilities to run a campaign like this, the only other one I would look at would be the Russians, and it's very clear that the Russians are currently tied up with the war in Ukraine right now. They legitimately really don't have the intelligence assets to spare beyond some of their strategic bombers, which, as Captain Osen and Emergent sort of pointed out earlier, they have a sort of a long-standing tradition of running some of their Tu-95 strategic bombers towards U.S. airspace and seeing what the response looks like that. And that's something that the United States has done as well with our B-52 platforms as well. It's kind of a long-standing deal there. And also previously, when we look at the Russians were party to the Open Skies Treaty that was signed in 1992 and existed until, I believe, 2020 or 2021, which essentially allowed Russian spy craft to overfly the continental and United States and our extended territories, as long as fair notice was given to NORAD in the case of the continental U.S. and Canada, and then other sort of U.S. combatant commands when it comes to areas like Guam, Puerto Rico, all of that fun stuff. Likewise, the United States was able to conduct spy intel gathering overflights of the entirety of the Russian Federation during that entire period. So what that means and why that matters is that the Russians, very much in regards to geospatial intelligence and everything like that, in regards to strategic nuclear capabilities, they already know everything that they would ever really want to know about the U.S. They know where silos are. They know where, which is important and why that treaty was signed, because the entire reason Open Skies was signed was to ensure that both the United States and Russia were abiding by some of the nuclear de-escalation treaties that were signed in the 90s. Anything from SALT II to New START, basically reducing the overall nuclear arsenals of both the United States and, at the time, then the Russian Federation. So it makes very little sense, to me at least, from what I've been looking at, for the Russians to all of a sudden start this sort of like balloon campaign, considering that the Russians already do have other ways of gathering intelligence. And to be quite frank, they know enough about the U.S. strategic nuclear arsenal that it really doesn't make sense for them to be expending a single dollar, or I guess a single ruble, on launching a new campaign for learning things that they would probably already know. That leaves, China, and then I guess someone could make the argument that it's in the interest of Iran to do it, but Iran doesn't have the capabilities to do it. They don't have the aircraft. They don't have honestly, they don't have the wind on their side in regards to if they wanted to launch a balloon campaign. And so we end up back at China. And so as was verified with the first incident about a week and a half ago, it was the Chinese running that. I really don't see any other indicators pointing to another nation other than the PRC launching these.
And the argument is and you've always been pragmatic on stage, so I always like to have you here. The argument that China made, I want to again look at everything objectively, that the first balloon was a weather balloon. And we've all dismissed it, and rightly so. Do you agree with us dismissing that as a weather balloon?
I would agree with dismissing it, but I would also say that that's actually really indicative as to why they're choosing balloons themselves. I think balloons and the use of wind as opposed to a designated sort of propulsion device like a propeller or a jet engine, if you really wanted to fit one onto a balloon, which wouldn't really work out that well, it's plausible deniability at the end of the day, right? because if you look at the initial sort of communications coming out of the PRC before they recognized that balloon, actually after they recognized that balloon as their own, they said it was wayward. They said it was a civilian research balloon. It was used for sort of weather analysis and everything like that. And when you're using no propulsion devices with something like a balloon, even though everyone here can recognize after just a quarter of analysis that if you launch a balloon from Inner Mongolia, it's likely going to end up in the continental U.S. because of how the jet stream operates. The use of a device that had zero propulsion lends towards the narrative that they were pushing, that this is off course. Like, we have no control over this. Why are you blaming us? We don't control the balloon. Nobody controls the balloon, right? So I think that's actually a very evidentiary sort of point to look at when we're seeing that the PRC has already done this, but also as a point when it comes to diplomacy, they can, point at it as a balloon and say, like, well, we didn't tell it to go here.
So I've got another question for you. I'll go to Mateus first. Maybe he's got some breaking news. My next question is about the Chinese military. And are they at a position where they could provoke the US to this extent? Or is just the US stretched so thin that they're taking advantage of the situation? And is that linked to what's happening in Taiwan as well? But before answering those questions, Austin, Mateus.
Yeah, Austin made some great points about the fact that the Chinese most likely considered using a balloon for the reasoning that they can kind of deny that they have control over it. Although, to play devil's advocate, U.S. officials have confirmed that though there wasn't any propeller or driving factor with these balloons, they were able to use those jet streams and kind of play with them, and it was intelligent enough to be maneuverable via the wind while moving up and down, changing altitudes, things like that. So the balloon definitely had direction and was being directed, just not in a way that we're commonly used to, and also in a way that it's very easy to make it look like the balloon just has a mind of its own.
Justin, can you quickly play the clip that you have from CNN? Would love to hear their thoughts on this, or the narrative they have before going back to Austin.
Sure. This is a retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton, CNN host who you'll recognize, is coming in and asking him a question about this same sort of prodding. He has a interesting answer, I think, might bring us to some other discussions.
The possibility that we might have a foreign power like China or Russia sort of poking and prodding with these objects, how concerning is that from a national security standpoint?
So these are the kinds of things.
These are major no-nos, aren't they?
Well, we do that all the time.
Yeah.
We do it to them, they do it to us. But here's the no-no part. We don't overfly their territory. They have, in these cases, overflown our territory. If it is, in fact, the objects 2 and 3 are, in fact, from either China or Russia. We know that in the case of the first object, the balloon, obviously the Chinese did that. That was the big no-no. So the way things run in the reconnaissance world now is, yes, you test the systems, but you don't overfly the systems, the air defense systems of an adversary.
Don't get caught.
And you certainly don't get caught, not like Francis Gary Powers back in the early 1960s, who definitely got caught. But the rules have changed since then, so we don't do that kind of thing anymore. Now, when it comes to these kinds of assessments, yes, the Chinese and the Russians are obviously always testing our air defenses. It's very logical that they did this again. Let's see if the facts bear that.
Well, so there again, we hear that sort of testing, prodding, and also the rules have changed. I think a few speakers have alluded to perhaps the ROE have changed when it comes to this, because the big no-no, as Lieutenant Colonel points out, is the deal is we typically don't actually go over them, and these have.
Yeah, so this is, Austin, this is the point I want to touch on, is that we are living in that new normal. China's military seems in a position where, it has the audacity to fly over US airspace, or fly over US territory. So this is the particular point that I want you to touch on, because this is the point that concerns me, where China's either responding to US support for Taiwan or taking advantage of the US being stretched thin with Ukraine. Before you answer, I do want to tell the audience, we're not going to keep the space running too much longer. I think we've covered the news pretty well. So make sure I don't have the pinned newsletter, but if you're following us, you'll be notified when we do the space again. So make sure you do follow us. So when we do the space, we'll probably cover it tomorrow if the next balloon or next UFO is shot down tomorrow morning. And we'll get a few special guests. We'll prep in advance because this is breaking news space, so we didn't prep for it. We'll have panelists ready, and we'll probably dive deeper into U.S.-Chinese relations and what this all means. Because for me, that is the biggest point of concern on a personal level. Austin?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you reiterate what specific point you wanted me to talk on there?
With Chinese spying by flying over U.S. Territory, this is the big no-no, and this is the line that's been crossed. Am I looking too deep into it, or this is a line that kind of leads us into a new normal where China is just a lot more courageous?
So I wouldn't say you're looking too deep into it. I think what's important though is historical context here. And as you know, the clip from Justin sort of pointed out, I think another major incident in history to sort of look into for this would be the Francis Gary Powers incident. In which case, you know, at the time, the United States was conducting U-2 spy plane overflights of the Soviet Union quite often, and the reason that we were able to do that was because of the altitude specifically that U-2s flew at. It was untouchable by any sort of gun or missile that the Soviets had until they finally could. And when we look at instances like this, no matter what sort of the geopolitical playing field looks like between nations like the PRC and the United States, there are always going to be attempts to conduct overflights, to conduct intelligence gathering, right? That is the name of the game. That's how it's played. What we're looking at in this case in particular is very similar to the shoot down of Francis Gary Powers in the way that the moment one side switches its calculus, whether that's via technology, whether that's via diplomacy, whether that's via a change in the rules of engagement or the ROE, that is what sort of changes the playing field with how different things are conducted. And from what we've seen previously, is that it appears that some of these balloon-based overflights were conducted earlier, not this year, but in other years, and those did not result in shoot downs. What is very clear is that after sort of the amount of public attention that was paid to the larger Chinese balloon that overflew the U.S., is that the ROE and the way that the DoD and NORAD are dealing with these incidents in regards to not just physically and kinetically, but also in regards to how they're releasing this information to the public has shifted. And from my perspective, do I think that this is a sort of a resource sink for the United States? Do I think the Chinese have anything to gain over the Taiwan situation on this? I would say no. If you want to talk on the resource angle, the United States has had a consistently rising defense budget since 2016, and before that, you know, that budget only decreased slightly from the years preceding. I don't think we're going to see any sort of, and if you look at the types of equipment being used here, you know, the F-22 hasn't been, as OSINT Captain and Emergent pointed out, the F-22 has not been exported anywhere in the world. The United States is the only nation in the world that has that particular airframe. And so moving forward, I think what we're looking at is we're seeing, on a diplomatic standpoint, we're seeing Chinese displeasure being forced onto the shoot down of that first balloon off the coast of South Carolina. But I don't see that as having a large scale impact on any of the logistics surrounding US Taiwan and PRC Taiwan relations. Because when we talk about something like that, we're not talking about balloons, which are generally fairly cheap to manufacture, right? We're talking about aircraft carriers. We're talking about, you know, total tonnage of a green water or a blue water fleet. And so I think what we're seeing right now is the Chinese have observed what the reaction was to that first balloon, and they're trying to drum up more attention over further balloons and try and make the current administration look incapable. I think we're looking at information ops in real time.
So let me ask you real quick, Emergent, if you don't mind, these new quote unidentified flying objects that are, you know, they might be coming from China, they might be coming somewhere else. It seems like with recent events, it's probably a lot of people are going to make the assumption they're coming from China. How long would they actually take to make that journey? Let's say they're balloons, okay, to float down the jet stream from China. What sort of time period are we looking at in order for them to get here? Would they have been launched before this balloon thing really started being a big deal?
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
I think I looked at the overview of the. It's been a few days since I looked at the article. The overview of the flight path of the original balloon, and I think it took three to 4 days from its estimated departure point. But that really depends on what the departure point is. I think it's a matter of a few days. It probably depends on the wind speed.
So based on that, it sounds like you're saying that these balloons would have been launched after the U.S. response to the previous balloon. You know, the
Yes, that would make sense.
Okay. And then what sort of capability does the United States have to be able to actually know where these launch points would be? Is that something that's realistic? Do we have the capability to even do that?
That's a lot of different. There's probably some Navy capability. Probably the ones who'd be most familiar with that would be NGIA, which is National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They have a lot of resources at tracking global assets like ship movements, supply and material movements. That's probably the primary source for the Ukraine, the Russian buildup on the Ukraine border. Things like departures of ships, shipping traffic, both civilian and military. So probably NGIA would be the primary source for that, but there are other possible sources.
Yeah, I do want to just ask you one last question. And before you answer that question, Emergent, I also want to get Cobbler report, the Kobesi letter, to give us final thoughts on the incidents that happened today. But just for the audience, we do these spaces whenever there's breaking news, as you probably all know. And there is a newsletter that we just started. It's pinned above. It's also retweeted on my account. You can subscribe there. Sorry, I just got woken up for the space, so I'm still a bit sleepy.
Sorry.
You can subscribe there to get a summary. No, all good, man. All good. I'm glad you woke me up. To get a summary of the spaces that we do. So make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. I do have one last question for you, Emergent. And by the way, my team is going to send you my number, Emergent. It'd be a pleasure to have you again as this situation develops over the next few days. And my question to you is for Chinese, and Austin was answering that question earlier, for Chinese flying objects, or for Chinese spying by flying over U.S. airspace. You seem you seemed relatively at ease with that. Why? Because am I one of the few that find it to be an escalation? I was listening to I was reading an article after the first balloon was shut down, and there, we know that China's spying on the US is spying on China, and the list goes on. Everyone's spying on everyone, but there are to-dos and not to-dos. And flying over the other country's airspace or territory is in the not to-do list. For that to change, is that a new normal? Is that an escalation?
So it's a new normal based. Sorry. I'm going to comment quickly here. I would say it's a new.
Yeah, go ahead, Austin. I'll go to Emergent. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
It's a new normal based upon technology, right? When in the era of when like spy overflights were conducted, specifically by the United States, they were either done by U-2 and later SR-71 platforms that were flying higher or faster, depending upon which platform. Than domestic air defense networks could respond to. After the advent of sort of wide-scale use of spy satellites, that hasn't really been necessary. We still have the U-2 platform, we still use it and everything like that, but the necessity for using piloted aircraft to conduct that sort of geospatial intelligence work has been largely supplanted by satellites. And so I would say that from what we're looking at right now with the balloons are different because I would posit that Chinese satellites have been orbiting, the United States for quite a while now, right? And so I think what we're looking at is not necessarily an escalation. It's more of a hark back to how espionage used to be conducted. And I think the public, that has been so far separated from the public since the glory days of the U-2 and the SR-71, that nations like Russia, nations like China don't have the need to run a piloted aircraft over the continental United States. They can just do that with a satellite. Unless
it has further capabilities. I know that Dr. Gorka wouldn't like me saying this, but we had someone on stage talk about I think it was an ex-general that was talking about the testing balloons for carrying nuclear arms. I can't remember what it was. Another person was mentioning the balloons interfering with communication networks. So there could be, and by the way, both these, the first point that I mentioned, that's highly, highly unlikely for anyone listening to this. But the point I'm making is there could be other capabilities for the balloons that the satellites couldn't achieve. Would you agree?
So what I would say to that, and that I think that's a very good point that you bring up, Mario, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed here, is the idea. So I've seen it talked about often too. Is what if one of these balloons is carrying a weapon of mass destruction, whether that's biological, chemical, nuclear, or as some have posited, like an EMP device, right? I believe the United States government, and I would also say I would believe if the United States were to do this to the Chinese government or the Russian government, I think every government's response would be the same. They would treat it as the use of a WMD on home soil, and they would respond to it overwhelmingly. I think that is one of the fundamental constructing pillars of the doctrine of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And so I am extremely apprehensive towards the idea that the Chinese are using this.
I meant, yes. So I meant, just to clarify, I meant not that they're not using it for this purpose today, but they kind of either testing it for that purpose or at least sending a signal like, "Hey, we could have included."
Exactly. And so what I view as the negative on that argument, though, is that if they were right, let's say that all of these balloons were undetected. The Chinese have the go ahead that if they wanted to conduct a mass attack on the United States via balloon, they're able to do that. So this dives in a little deeper into the concept of the nuclear triad. And the nuclear triad is the idea that just about every nuclear armed nation is able to deliver their weapons of mass destruction via three major pillars. The first being silos, so ICBMs, missiles. The second being aircraft, so via air bases from bombers. And the third being from submarines. That third pillar is the most important here, right? Because even if the Chinese really believe that they would be able to shut down the American power grid, drop a biological weapon from a balloon, which isn't really viable considering how biological weapons work, but let's say hypothetically it could, or, a large-scale nuclear attack conducted via, going under the radar, so to speak, even though that's not the case either. There's nothing in there that considers U.S. submarine positions at all. So I think the best way to put this argument to bed, and this is why I don't believe that this is the case, that the Chinese are trying to build up for a WMD attack later, is that, as we've already sort of gone over, these balloons, as of right now, as we've seen, are unguided. And if you're going to conduct a strategic attack using weapons of mass destruction, you need to hit certain areas. You need to hit silos. You need to hit radar networks. You need to hit, most importantly, submarines. And no balloon is ever going to find a U.S. nuclear submarine, just as any American balloon would never find a Russian nuclear submarine. And I think that's the best way to sort of talk about that.
Emergent, would you agree with Austin's response to this? Can you hear me, Emergent? The mic is not there.
There it is. There it is.
You're good.
Sorry,
Yeah, all good, man.
lagged.
Yeah, all good, man. All good.
Yeah, I think I agree with his point of view. I think a lot of this is probably more probing. I mean, it's not unlike in some ways what a lot of what people don't know. A lot of what the Navy does. There's things like international agreements, like each country gets I think it's 15 miles of sovereign waters outside, but then there's international agreements about certain areas. But there's always been these cases where some country will just declare, oh yeah, well, the normal is 15 miles, but we declare 20 miles, right? The Gulf of Sidra incident in the 80s, where Gaddafi declared that, oh yeah, well, I get 200 miles of the Mediterranean as sovereign Libyan territory, and it was Reagan sent the carrier strike group there to shoot down his planes and prove to the world that no, that's not your territory. So in a way, this is kind of, in a certain sense, it's kind of the Chinese doing the same thing, testing the limits, probing, seeing what they find out, seeing what the reaction is. Yeah, I think. And by the way, I linked two articles down there about the incident I talked about earlier, which I think is very historically interesting, and it's not very widely publicized. There was The 2004 incident was it was not, I said, I misspoke earlier, I said congressman. It was actually the governor of Kentucky, Governor Fletcher, in 2004. He flew in to DC without filing a flight plan, and it was in complete violation of the post 9/11 rules, and they almost shot him down. So I posted it in the links. There's both an NBC and a WAPO article about it. Really, they even went so far as to evacuate the Capitol building because they thought it was another hijack scenario. So read that, very interesting historical info, and kind of paints you a picture of what that is actually like.
Hey Mario,
Thanks
one
a
quick
lot.
question for
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
your experts here is, what if this is just sort of a general trend? So several weeks ago, whenever they had their big meetings in China to sort of consolidate power, Hu Jintao was removed from those meetings in sort of a major spectacle that was a break from tradition, typically not something that China would do. And following that, when the World Cup started and people were following live coverage, and they suddenly saw not just people at the World Cup, but people around the world celebrating in mass, it started to dawn on the people that something about what was happening in their own country wasn't matching up to what the rest of the world was doing with respect to COVID. And so I just can't help but wonder if China may need some wins in some ways, because of the amount of duress that their leadership may be under now. And I long speculated that China couldn't keep a zero COVID policy and go to war in Taiwan and other NATO nations. And so I just wonder if there's a sort of pivot out of a little bit of anxiety over. You could argue that in the worst possible world, China handled COVID so poorly. And if people in America and other Western nations are upset about how we've been treated during these times, imagine what a population like that must be feeling after they've been locked down for years, used inadequate vaccines, and then
I think,
still.
Kosabi, I would love you to answer that question. Kosabi, I'd love you to answer that question, and answer the question that I had. I think my question and Carl's question kind of go in line. Is what why is China doing this? So I'd love you to answer that question, and we'll go to Piotr as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, the first thing I'll say is I just pinned this timeline that we just tweeted a few minutes ago. Why? I mean, it took us 3 days to shoot down the first balloon. Now we're shooting down these UFOs almost by the hour, and this whole thing over Montana in the morning that we're going to engage with. China is testing the waters here, but I also think the U.S. is also testing the waters. They're trying to see when they shoot down a Chinese-owned balloon or some sort of Chinese-based espionage, what's the Chinese reaction to this, right? And we're coming off, the Kobesi letter, we're a financial publication, so we're kind of looking more into what does this mean more on the economic side? I mean, we're coming off a historic trade war from the Trump era between the U.S. and China. We're finally starting to see supply chains normalize, but then we also know that China has their eyes on Taiwan, which is the biggest producer of semiconductors in the world. So, is this China trying to poke at the U.S. and see? All right, well, this is their reaction if we fly over the U.S. What happens if we keep flying over, Taiwanese waters, or we sail around Taiwan? What is this going to do? Is the U.S. going to impose, further tariffs like we saw over the last few years? So I think China is really just trying to see what happens. I mean, we're going to keep testing the waters here, and we know that China has their eyes on Taiwan. I mean, we know that they're expected to invade by 2027, and we also know that tech companies have been under pressure, and China knows. So I think they see now is the time when we're a little bit more vulnerable, and this is in the news, and it's become very political. So I really think they're just going to keep testing the waters here. And now that all Americans are watching this in the media, it's become extremely it's become kind of this media battle of which side is stronger. So we could see this keep escalating, and until one side puts a clear end to it, it's going to get a little bit more dirty, we think.
Mario, a quick follow-up for him would be, after your guest several days ago, the general that said he could see it wouldn't be far-fetched for him to see a scenario where things escalate to the point that China makes a move on Taiwan before the next election. And so what I guess I'm trying to ponder here is the meta-narrative about China is that they think dynastically, whereas we think quarterly and every 2 years for our, midterm elections, and then our major elections every 4 years. But they think 100 years out, 500 years out. Well, what if they handled things so poorly that in order to maintain the sort of narrative dominance, they've just had to update their prognostications about 2027? Okay, well, what if that timeline has been expedited now because they have to do something to reassert themselves in the world?
Yeah, that's. I mean, especially as this whole 2027 deadline has been in the
So,
media
Kyle,
for
there's a couple of things I
the
want to
last
jump.
few weeks.
Is it me or is Piotr messing up?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, your connection, Piotr.
Can
Can
you
you hear me?
Yeah, I can
Your
hear you.
connection's
Can you
really
hear me?
bad, man.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, you're back now. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, Carl, I think you're very astute. What is the biggest fear that autocrats have? It's for their population to become more enlightened, for them to become more informed about the, the opportunities and freedoms and liberties that other countries, other populations, other civilizations have. Right. Look at the Soviet Union. What did they try ever so hard to do? To limit the amount of infiltration of Western media, pop culture, and so on during the late 20th century. So when the zero COVID policy happened and the white paper protests, as they became unofficially to be known, happened, that was the biggest threat that President Xi has faced during his premiership since he took office. And this is significant because it's the first time we've seen this form of China. There's much more assertive wolf warrior diplomacy, which is just a fancy way of saying they're more assertive in their foreign policy, going about, having to deal with demographic and domestic issues. So they have two main things now. They have domestic crisis, both from a housing issue, housing bubble, and a public health crisis. And then that is playing into their foreign policy aspirations and interests. So when you have Taiwan on the radar, which is, I still remain on the fence as to whether or not they ever actually intend to invade, and I'll give you a couple of reasons why in a minute. This is something that you could potentially see pushing up their agenda as to why they need to do it sooner rather than later. President Xi isn't getting younger, and he wants to be the man to restore China to its glory days, as you mentioned, the dynastic period. So I don't know whether or not what's happening now, i.e. with these balloons, with these aerial objects, has any direct significance to Taiwan, because this is the US mainland, and this doesn't necessarily play into the US strategical narrative when it comes to Taiwan. But I do think that this is definitely an interesting development. As I said before, the Canadians and the Americans have a partnership with each other regarding airspace defense. So this engagement between Trudeau and Biden was not that surprising. And I don't think that this aerial object is of immediate national security, because otherwise the US Air Force and others wouldn't be allowing it to bob about over US airspace over the night. So to your point about Taiwan, very last point, I think is that it's not going to happen yet. When I spoke to, we had Brigadier General Robert Spalding here, and I've spoken to various other American defense officials in the past on my podcast, and there's varying degrees of interest over how much this could happen. It's definitely something that is on the radar, but the reason why I remain skeptical is because China, in times of strife, specifically the party, need a object. They need something to stimulate nationalistic sentiment, and Taiwan is the perfect example of that. And I think that you could see this remaining always a bit on the precipice of, on the possibility of invading Taiwan, but never actually being done so. The Chinese have definitely got more emboldened in the past 10 years, but we've also seen, even in the past 6 months, President Xi's foreign policy narrative change a little bit. When he spoke to the Saudis, when he spoke to the Iranians, he was a little bit more Well, when he went to the G20 meeting, and even at the World Economic Forum, a representative of China was there to try and emphasize that China is more collaborative now. I don't believe that for a second, but I think it illustrates that China is trying to be a little bit more nuanced with its way of conducting foreign policy, and these balloons and other stuff may well be just another part of that psychological warfare. I'll land there.
Adam, anything to add? And I know that the Kubasi letter was also speaking. Anything to add, guys, on what Piotr mentioned? And I want to go to a final question. Intel Schizo, who's been on the stage before, did send me a great explanation of why he thinks China is using balloons, which could look like outdated technology for many of us. So I'll give Intel Schizo the mic right after Adam and Kubasi letter respond as well, if they've got anything to add. Adam.
Yeah, anything I would add would be taking us way too off course. So I'll let Intel Schizo or Kubasi go ahead.
I appreciate it, Adam. And by the way, I've just sent you through my number. Would love to have you on a future space on this story. Kubasi letter, anything to add? Because I know you were speaking earlier when Piotr glitched out.
Yeah, I mean, nothing really to add. I think a lot of what we've said has kind of been echoed in here. But I mean, obviously the whole Taiwan, we were talking about the whole 2027 Taiwan invasion timeline. I mean, it's up in the air, but also, China doesn't want, they know that it's critical that they move quick on this kind of thing if they're going to do it. And they don't want this to be something in the media for 3 years, 4 years before it happens. So whether this is a sign of them testing the waters to see what the U.S. would do if tensions were to escalate or not, and now, even if this wasn't intended to be something as a major topic, now that it's all over the media, they might look to capitalize on it. So that timeline definitely is dynamic.
And Intel Schizo, I'll give you the mic just to kind of tell the audience the message that you sent me about why you think China could be using balloons when they've got satellites.
Yeah, so China's been seeing near space, that's the term that they dub it, as a new front for military powers across the world to start competing in. They've looked at the United States. There's tons of articles out there in Chinese academic papers. There's like over 1,000 on just near space designs of various equipment. They see this as the next frontier for military technology, and they don't want to be left behind, and they don't want to be behind the ball compared to other countries, and they've really focused in on this. They see that this section of space has advantages over satellites, whether it's the geospatial imagery side, you can get better resolution photos, whether it's the SIGINT side where you can do collections a little better.
And I do. Skids, I just want to share something very briefly. Just got breaking news from Breaking 4 News. Mateus, who's on stage, just want to mention it briefly. We'll cover it tomorrow, but Iranian president will visit China from Tuesday to Thursday at the invitation of President Xi Jinping. That was quoted by China's foreign ministry, and that was just in the past half an hour. I think it was the piece of news came out 10 minutes ago, so I'm guessing this is very recent. Came on the Jerusalem Post. Mateus, when was that announced? Do you know? When did China announce this?
It seems to be, it seems to be that it was announced fairly recently. I forwarded you the report that I saw from the Jerusalem Post, but it was also reported by Global Times, the Chinese state-affiliated media that went out at 11:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So it's been going out within the past 10-15 minutes. Yeah,
I appreciate it, man. And Justin, I know you've got a really interesting clip that you wanted to play as well that Tom Fitton tweeted.
Yeah, our own Tom Fitton just uploaded this to his account. This was a presser I think he had, and it's all about what our topic du jour.
Believe me, Judicial Watch is going to investigate the heck out of this. We had FOIAs that went out immediately in response to this attack. We're going to find out what went on, what's gone on previously, and what other risks we're facing as a result of this haplessness from this, not only the Biden administration, but our defense establishment. This is a sad day for America. It's concerning. It's disturbing in the sense that we are kind of like this hapless giant, unable to do anything in the face of this rather obvious provocation, this brazen attack on our sovereignty, and the failure and the exposure of our weakness in the face of this. And the weakness, it's not in my view, a technological or military weakness. It's political weakness. This is the decision by our military leadership, with the approval, presumably, of President Biden, who's commander in chief, not to do anything to protect our homeland from this ongoing attack.
So I think obviously Tom up in arms and the FOIA king that he is. That'll be interesting to see what it comes back.
Yeah, Tom's a regular on the space, so I've just DM'd him. We'll bring him on tomorrow to get his thoughts on this. Nick, I think we should cover this tomorrow when the next balloon or next UFO, if it gets shot down over Montana, will be good space to kick off with a focus on U.S.-China relations. What do you think, Nick?
Absolutely. I think this is going to continue developing here, especially because it does seem like the U.S. government has said that they're going to resume this operation that they were working on tonight when daylight breaks in Montana.
Yeah, and as always, we'll keep things objective, try to give you the facts, and always have balanced opinions on the panel. But I think it was great. I was just giving one a massive shout out to Raw's Alerts and Breaking 4 News for playing a key role in getting this space started and giving us all the information we need, and all the panelists that we had that came on and off, and of course Nick for helping co-host the space, and our regular panelists. We have Austin, Piotr, who are regulars on the space. Justin for playing the clips. He's the clip guy. Justin, you're the best for playing clips and giving commentary on those clips. I love it, man. So if you could do it in every space. Yeah, the way he does it, the audio's impeccable. His commentary, it's on point, never glitching. So yeah, Justin, I'm probably going to give you a call after this.
I kept the comedy to a minimum. I was going to bring up, the Welcome to Earth clip from Will Smith, but we'll play that for another time.
yeah. You DM me, Justin. DM me, say, Mario, I've got this clip. I'm like, no, man, not this space, not today. I also want to give a shout out, All Source News and other panelists that are regulars on the space. But otherwise, yeah, I think it was a great space. Really enjoyed it for the audience. Hope you enjoyed it as well. The newsletter's pinned above. It's retweeted on my account. If you want a summary of the space, otherwise, to see us whenever there's breaking news, we'll be covering it. Okay, love you all. Thank you so much. Ian, Nick, anything to add, and Alex as well.
Yeah, no, that's about it. Yeah, because we're gonna have a lot more.
What about the newsletter? You got to advertise the newsletter.
I did 3 times. I did my job this time. I did. Don't get angry at me, Ian. Don't get angry at me.
Oh, okay.
2023 is sure is weird. So
man, yeah, it's I got woken up for this. I was literally asleep.
Don't jinx it, Raw. We had 22 stars. Don't jinx it too soon. Don't jinx it.
Yeah. But I like how that's the second time I get woken up this year, a second or third time. So, but I think this time, Nick, you woke me up a bit late because you were like wondering. Because last time you woke me up and it wasn't major. It's like, should I wake him up? Should I not wake him up? Should I wake him up? Should I not wake him up? And it took you a while.
Chatting, and we were like, should we wake Mario up about this? And,
no, and I was like, yeah, I just did like 5 minutes ago, but Mario.
It's probably good we didn't do the space yesterday.
yeah, I get no one. I've never been woken up in like years and years. No one. I never put an alarm. So this new lifestyle of being woken up for breaking news, I got to get used to it. But no, when there's something major, don't be shy. All right, everyone, thank.
All right, that's it, guys. We're gonna keep an eye on it. I don't want to keep you guys up here all night with this madness, but if you guys get any news updates or anything like that, you can contact me through the comment section on YouTube, or hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, all those fun things. I definitely appreciate you guys. That's crazy. I mean, who knows? Is it a Chinese spy thing? There's the Twitter link right there. Is it just a distraction? Thank you, Alien, for being here. Thank you to my moderators. There's that Rumble link for you guys, too, if you want to follow me on those 2 other platforms. I didn't even expect to go live tonight on that. I saw that happening. I got a truth alert from Disclose TV. I'm not sure if you guys saw that or not. I'll show you that. where they had the base shut down. Yeah, that's the truth that I got where it showed the disclosed TV just in United States closes airspace over north central Montana. We were in ABL's chat and I'm like, what the hell is this? Yes, sir. I did get those emails. Anthony, thank you for sending those. But I wasn't even expecting to go live tonight. I saw that happening and I figured, fuck it. Let's do this thing. Let's cover it. You subs to my Twitter. Thank you, Awesome Alice. I appreciate that. Oh, you told ABL when you called about it? I was still in ABL's chat, but I had the volume down because I was trying to listen to these gentlemen over here. But I appreciate you giving them that information. It's always good to give him info because he's got a bigger crowd. You know, he can get a lot of information out there. If there's something we think we need to let him know about, that's cool that you can call in and let him know. Always appreciated. Thank you to my rebels. Boom. Good night, everybody that's came in. I definitely appreciate you. All the new folks. The 66X. Always comedy. It's awesome. Thank you to my moderators, Anthony McQuaid, Atomic Tabasco, Cat F, Zeta Weechi's Cane Sword, and Sonia's Scrapbook. Maybe I'll get some of those emails too. That's cool. I appreciate you doing your part, sir. You're a big help. If you didn't know, now you know. Good night, everybody. If you got any info, holler at me. We'll see you on the next one. I'll be live on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock on Twitter and Rumble and YouTube. Thanks again, guys. Have a great night.
Oh.